She was a newly divorced mom with 2 kids and barely enough to make rent when she bid $900. On a burnt-down house no one else wanted, everyone told her it was a mistake. Dangerous, worthless, impossible to rebuild. But behind a locked steel door in the basement, she found something that hadn't seen daylight in over a century. The lost work of a forgotten inventor worth millions, and powerful enough to change the future. This is the story of how one woman turned ashes into a home and protected a secret the world was never meant to find. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The county courthouse smelled faintly of dust and old paper, the kind of air that seemed to settle into the wood over decades and never leave. Rows of metal folding chairs had been set up in the meeting hall, their legs scraping against the scuffed linoleum whenever someone shifted. Claire Donovan sat near the middle, her hands wrapped around the handle of her worn leather bag, elbows tucked close, as if taking up less space might make her invisible. She hadn't planned to be here. She'd told herself she was only stopping in to watch, to see how these small-town auctions worked. Maybe as a distraction from the weeks of bill notices and late-night phone calls with her sister, telling her to be practical. But when they reached Lot 17, something in her refused to stay quiet. The auctioneer's voice was a dry rhythm, the kind of practiced monotone that could rattle through property descriptions without pause. Lot 17, parcel number 14231B. Located on East Hollow Road, he read from a sheet. One fire-damaged Victorian residence on 0.62 acres, sold AGs, where is no warranty of condition, minimum bid $900. He glanced at the crowd, but the weight in the room barely shifted. People studied their shoes, flipped through the packet, or let their eyes glaze over. Everyone in the county knew about the old Whitcomb place. The fire had gutted the second floor 15 years ago, and since then it had sat empty, boarded up, a blackened silhouette against the ridge. It was the kind of property no one wanted, because the cost to tear it down outweighed the land's value. Claire felt the familiar sting of resignation, that quiet, hollow acceptance that some things in life were simply out of reach. She had come here looking for something to tell her life was still in motion, that not every decision had been made for her already. Divorce had left her in a cramped rental on the edge of town, her teaching hours cut back, her savings thinned to almost nothing. The firehouse gossip said the Whitcomb place was cursed, but curses were for people with the luxury of believing. In them, she didn't have that luxury. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Do I hear 900? Silence. He looked up, scanning the crowd with polite patience. Claire heard the whisper of paper from someone flipping a page, a cough, the faint creak of a chair. He started again. 900? Anyone? Still nothing. It wasn't a price so much as a sentence. The number hung in the air, unwanted. She felt her hand rise before her mind caught up. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a small lift. Fingers still curled around the edge of her bag. The auctioneer's eyes landed on her, his voice picking up half a note. "I have 900, any advance." The pause that followed stretched, thin, like a thread ready to snap. She felt dozens of eyes turned toward her, not out of competition, but mild disbelief. No one else raised a hand. The man with the gavel nodded once. 900, going once, going twice. His voice didn't bother to build drama. Sold. Lot 17 to bidder number 42, the sound of the gavel hitting wood was sharper than she expected. It broke the room's stillness, and with it came a flutter in her chest. Not excitement, exactly, but something close. She signed the paperwork in a corner of the room, the county clerk's pen leaving a thin trail of ink across forms she didn't entirely understand. Behind the counter, a stack of manila envelopes waited for each buyer. When hers slid across to her, it felt heavier than it should have. The deed, tucked inside alongside warnings about liability, condition, and the fact that the county accepted no responsibility for what she was walking into. Outside, the late autumn air carried the smell of wood smoke from somewhere up the hill. Claire stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, the envelope pressed against her side, watching as the other bidders drifted toward their trucks. Nobody stopped to ask her why she'd done it. She wouldn't have had an answer ready. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the idea that for less than a month's rent, she could own something, even if that something was a shell. She thought about Evan and Mara, about the way Evan had started avoiding conversations about the future, about how Mara's sketches filled the margins of every piece of paper she could find. A house wasn't just walls and a roof. Sometimes it was a reason to start again. She walked to her car, the cold seeping through the thin soles of her shoes, and sat for a long minute before starting the engine. The envelope lay on the passenger seat like an unspoken dare. $900 had bought her a burnt-down house that no one else wanted. She wasn't sure yet whether she'd just made her first real step forward or another in a long line of mistakes. But as she turned the key, she felt that same flutter again. Faint but persistent, the quiet thrill of having done something that was hers alone. The road to East Hollow wound between bare-limbed maples and weathered stone walls, the kind of old country stretch where every bend seemed to hold the memory of another time. Claire kept both hands on the steering wheel, the envelope from the auction folded neatly on the dashboard as if to prove the trip was real. Evan sat in the passenger seat with his hood pulled up, eyes fixed on the blur of trees, while Mara leaned forward from the back, chin resting on the headrest between them. She had been asking questions since they left town. How big was it? What color had it been before the fire? Whether they could plant flowers in the spring? Claire had answered in pieces, careful not to promise more than she knew. The turnoff to the property was almost hidden, a narrow gravel drive choked with weeds. The tires crunched over frosted grass as the trees parted to reveal the house. Even in daylight, it looked like something caught between ruin and memory. The second floor was gutted, skeletal beams exposed to the pale sky where a roof should have been, charred clapboards curled away from the frame. And one entire section of the porch sagged toward the earth as if exhausted from holding on. The fire had taken its share, but it had left the bones standing tall, stubborn, and somehow still watching over the lot. Claire cut the engine. For a moment, none of them spoke. The air was sharp with the damp smell of leaves, but beneath it lingered a faint tank of smoke, the kind that clings to a sweater long after a campfire has gone cold. She could almost imagine it drifting up from the blackened window frames, curling into the November air. Evan stepped out first, his sneakers crunching on the gravel. He tilted his head back to take in the empty rafters, his expression caught between curiosity and doubt. "You bought this for $900? He asked, not accusing, just trying to fit the image in front of him into something that made sense. Mara didn't wait for permission. She bounded toward the porch, her boots skidding slightly on the frost. "It's huge," she said, pressing her hands against a scorched support beam up close. The damage was more complicated. The fire had eaten deep in some places, but in others the paint had only blistered, the grain beneath still solid. Claire followed more slowly, her eyes tracing the lines of the house the way she used to study floor plans in magazines, imagining the work it would take to bring it back. The front door was gone, replaced by a sheet of plywood nailed across the frame. Someone had spray painted "Keep Out" in uneven red letters, the warning now faded to a dull pink. A corner of the board had pulled away, leaving enough space to slip through. Evan tested it, then glanced back at her. "You want to see inside?" His voice carried a caution she recognized. He was already thinking about nails, rot, the quiet dangers of a place left alone too long. They stepped into a hallway where the light shifted suddenly, filtered through missing boards and broken glass. The floor was layered with brittle leaves and plaster dust, the walls stripped in patches to reveal lath. In the living room, a brick fireplace still stood, its hearth lined with ash that looked almost fresh despite the years. A collapsed section of ceiling revealed the skeletal remains of the upstairs, charred beams intersecting like the ribs of a shipwreck. Mara's boots scuffed the floor as she moved from room to room, her gaze darting to each shadow as if expecting the house to speak. Claire found herself listening to. Old houses had their own kind of silence, dense and layered, carrying echoes of voices and footsteps long gone. Here, it was different, an emptiness threaded with something heavier. She could feel it in the cool air against her skin, the faint pull of history in the dark corners. She imagined the night of the fire, heat, smoke, the frantic crack of timbers splitting. Then the years after, the house sitting through winters and summers, abandoned but never entirely forgotten. They didn't go upstairs. The staircase was bowed, the railing loose at its joints. Instead, they circled back toward the kitchen, where rusted fixtures clung stubbornly to blackened walls. An old enamel sink was still fixed under a window, the glass above it fractured into a spiderweb of lines. Through it, she could see the yard tangled grass, the remains of a garden bed, a stone path disappearing into weeds. It was easy to imagine someone tending it once, long before fire and time had pulled the place apart. Outside again, the cold felt sharper. Claire stood on what was left of the porch, looking up at the house as if it might reveal something if she watched long. "Enough!" Evan kicked at the gravel, his hands buried in his pockets. "It's a lot," he said quietly. She nodded, not pretending otherwise. Mara came to stand beside her, cheeks flushed from exploring. "It smells like campfires," she said, her voice almost wistful. Claire didn't answer right away. She let the scent of smoke settle around her, carrying with it the weight of what they'd taken on. It was damaged, dangerous, and more than she could afford to fix. But it was also hers, a place with a story still hidden beneath the soot and silence. And standing there with her children, she felt the first small stirrings of something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. Not certainty, but possibility. Claire had just closed the car door when she noticed the figure watching from across the road. The woman stood on the porch of a small white farmhouse, one hand gripping the railing, the other tucked into the pocket of a thick wool cardigan. Even from a distance, Claire could tell she was older, her back a little bent, her stance steady in a way that spoke of long years spent on the same stretch of land. The November light was thin, casting shadows that deepened the lines of her face. She didn't wave, didn't smile, just stood there, as if weighing whether the sight of strangers on East Hollow Road was worth her attention. Claire turned to Evan and Mara, who were still gathering their things from the back seat. "Stay here." "A minute," she said, and crossed the gravel drive toward the farmhouse. Her boots crunched over the frost, each step feeling more deliberate under the woman's gaze. When she reached the edge of the porch, the scent of wood smoke and something faintly herbal drifted from the house. Up close, the woman's eyes were a sharp, clear gray, the kind that didn't miss much. "You bought the Whitcomb place," the woman said, not as a question. Her voice was low and steady, the syllables touched by a New England drawl that softened the edges. Claire nodded. "Yesterday, at the county auction," the woman's mouth pressed into a thin line. She gave a small shake of her head, as though the outcome had been inevitable. "Name's Keating, lived here 50 years. Seen more of that house than most. And I'll tell you something, Miss Donovan, it was trouble before the fire." The words settled heavily in the cold air between them. Claire tried to keep her expression neutral. "What kind of trouble?" Mrs. Keating's gaze shifted toward. "The blackened shape of the house across the road never sat right with me. That place. Folks who lived there kept to themselves. Doors locked all the time, even the ones inside. But the basement," she paused, her fingers tightening slightly on the porch rail. "That basement was never open. Not once in all the years the Whitcombs lived there. And it's not because it was full of junk. No, they guarded it." Claire glanced back at the house, its dark windows staring blankly toward them. "You mean they locked it from the inside?" Mrs. Keating gave a slow nod. "Sturdy iron door. I saw it once when I brought over pies after their youngest was born. Jonas, the father, he came to the threshold before I could even step in, shut the door behind him like the devil himself was down there." The wind picked up, stirring the bare branches overhead. Mara's laugh carried faintly from the car, where she was showing Evan something she'd drawn in her notebook. Claire's shifted her weight, feeling the cold seeped through the soles of her boots. "Do you know what was in it?" she asked. "I know what wasn't," Mrs. Keating said. "No coal, no tools, no canned goods like every other cellar in this county. Folks whispered plenty over the years, money hidden from the bank, something left over from the war, maybe worse. But no one ever proved a thing. Then, after the fire, she trailed off, eyes narrowing as though the memory itself was suspect. They pulled out fast, didn't salvage much, and no one's been down there since." The thought of a space sealed off for decades sent a faint chill through Claire that had nothing to do with the weather. She wanted to ask more about the family, about what might be waiting under all that soot and ash, but Mrs. Keating's posture had shifted. Her body angled toward the door in the universal signal that the conversation was ending. "You've got children," the older woman said, her tone softening slightly. "You mind where they wander in there? That house doesn't give up its secrets easy, and sometimes there's a reason for that. Claire nodded, though she wasn't sure what she was agreeing to. "Thank you for telling me." Mrs. Keating's eyes lingered on her for a moment longer. Then she turned and stepped back into the shadowed doorway. The screen door shut with a creak, and the farmhouse porch was empty again. Walking back to the car, Claire found herself glancing toward the corner of the house where she'd noticed the steel basement door the day before. Even from here, she could picture it clearly blackened around the edges. The hinges thick as a vault's, the lock still in place. Mara looked up as she slid into the driver's seat. "Who was that?" "Just a neighbor," Claire said. "Starting the engine? What did she say?" Evan asked. Though his eyes stayed fixed on the house as they pulled away, Claire hesitated. "She told me to be careful," she said at last, "and that some doors stay locked for a reason." The words sat with her all the way back to town, following her like the faint, stubborn scent of smoke clinging to the folds of her coat. The phone rang just as Claire was setting 2 chipped mugs of cocoa on the table for Evan and Mara. The smell of cocoa powder and warm milk filled the small kitchen, masking the faint draft that crept under the back door. She checked the screen, Renee. The name alone carried a weight. Not because her older sister meant harm, but because her calls rarely arrived without advice folded neatly inside them, sharp at the corners, letting the sound of the kids' voices fade behind her. "Hey," she said, keeping her tone light. "I just saw your name in the county auction report." Renee's voice was crisp, the kind of tone sharpened by years of working in Boston. Offices where hesitation wasn't tolerated. "Tell me it's not true." Claire leaned against the wall, running her finger along a groove in the old plaster. "If you mean the house on East Hollow Road, yeah, it's true. You bought the Whitcomb place, Claire, for God's sake." Renee exhaled into the receiver, a long sound that suggested equal parts disbelief and irritation. "You can't raise kids in a ruin. You know that, right?" "It's not about it." "Not about what?" Renee cut in. "Because from where I'm sitting, it's about safety. It's about you living on the edge already and then going and buying a burned-out death trap." Claire closed her eyes. For a moment, she could picture her sister at her desk, hair pulled into a smooth knot, glasses perched low, a pen tapping against a legal pad. Renee had always been the one to make the safe choices, to look at numbers before anything else. Claire envied that clarity sometimes, even when it felt like judgment. "I'm not moving us in tomorrow," Claire said. "It's land. It's a start. It's a liability," Renee countered. "You're thinking like someone who wants to be rescued by a miracle, but miracles don't pay for new roofs or structural repairs. That place will drain you dry before you even get the smell of smoke out of it." Claire glanced toward the kitchen. Through the doorway, she could see Mara doodling in her notebook, her head bent low, Evan leaning over to watch. The picture of them in that ruined house flashed in her mind, light pouring through missing boards, their boots leaving prints in the dust. There had been something alive in that moment, something she couldn't put into words. "I know it's a mess," she said quietly. "It's worse than a mess. Sell it, Claire. You could turn a quick profit, even if it's just for the lot. Take the money and put it towards something livable. A condo, a real house, something that doesn't look like it's one strong wind from collapsing." The suggestion landed like a stone in her stomach. A part of her knew Renee was right about the money, the risk, the endless work ahead. But another part, the one that had raised her hand at the auction before she could talk herself out of it, felt rooted in place. "I can't explain it," Claire said. "There's something there." "What hidden treasure?" Renee's laugh was soft but edged. "Come on, don't tell me you're getting caught up in small-town ghost stories." "It's not ghosts," Claire replied. "It's just potential." There was a pause on the line, long enough for Claire to hear the faint hum of Renee's office heater. "You've always been like this," Renee said finally, "jumping in because it feels right, and then calling me when the bills get too big. I'm telling you now, I can't bail you out of this one. I'm not asking you to." "Good," Renee said, but her voice had softened slightly. "I just don't want to see you sink everything into something that's already gone." They said their goodbyes, the conversation ending not with resolution, but with that same space that always stretched between them, part concern, part unspoken difference in how they saw the world. Claire slid the phone into her pocket and stood for a moment in the quiet hallway, the weight of her sister's words pressing at the edges of her resolve. When she returned to the kitchen, Mara looked up from her drawing. "Was that Aunt Renee?" "Yeah," Claire said, taking her seat. "What did she say?" Evan asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Claire wrapped her hands around her mug, letting the heat seep into her fingers. She thinks the house is too much. Evan shrugged, but Mara tilted her head, studying her mother's face. Do you think it's too much? Claire thought about the blackened beams, the sealed basement door, the way the air in that place seemed to hold its breath. She thought about the thin flutter of possibility she'd felt standing there. I think it's ours, she said. Neither child pressed her further, and for a moment the kitchen felt warm again, though she could still feel the weight of doubt in her chest. A reminder that belief alone wouldn't keep the walls from falling. The plywood that had been nailed across the front door groaned as Evan pried it loose, each pull releasing a small puff of dust and the faint, acrid scent of smoke that had been sealed inside for years. Claire stood close enough to see the dark smudges the fire had left along the threshold, her hand wrapped around Mara's shoulder as if to anchor them both. Beyond the doorway, the interior yawned open in shadows and light fractured by broken windows. Stepping inside was like stepping into a memory that didn't belong to them. The air was cool and heavy, tinged with the unmistakable scent of charred wood, but beneath it there was another smell, faint and almost sweet, like old varnish. Dust swirled in the beams of sunlight, cutting through gaps in the walls. The floor creaked under their weight, the boards shrunken and warped from years of exposure, but still solid enough to hold them. They started in what had once been the front parlor. The wallpaper was gone, burned or peeled away long ago, leaving the wooden lath bare in some places, blackened plaster clinging in others. A chandelier hung in the center of the room, its arms drooping slightly, its glass ornaments warped and cloudy from heat. Mara tilted her head up, watching the light catch on one remaining crystal teardrop. It's like it melted, she whispered. Claire imagined the fire's heat blooming across the ceiling, twisting the delicate fixture until it sagged under its own weight. Evan crossed to one wall and crouched, running his fingers over a section of wood trim that had escaped the worst of the flames. The molding was carved in a pattern of repeating leaves, the details still crisp despite the soot that dulled their edges. This wasn't cheap, he said, glancing back at Claire. Somebody cared about the way this place looked. In the next room, the floor dipped slightly toward the center, a ripple left behind by water pooling during the fire hose's work. The boards were stained in irregular patches, some planks split where the grain had twisted under heat. Her eyes followed the line of the baseboards up to the windows, where the frames, though scorched, were still sturdy and thick. The glass panes were long gone, leaving only jagged triangles in the corners, but the casements themselves were solid oak, their joinery still tight. They moved into the dining room, where a massive built-in sideboard dominated one wall. Its glass doors had shattered, leaving sharp fragments glittering in the dust along the floor. But the shelves inside were intact, and the wood grain gleamed where Claire brushed away the grime. She imagined the space once holding fine china, or heavy serving dishes, the room lit by the chandelier's twin hanging above the long-gone table. The kitchen told a different story. Here, time and neglect had done more damage than fire. The sink beneath the cracked window was an old porcelain farmhouse basin, its surface crazed with fine spiderweb cracks. Mara ran her hand along the counter, her fingertips leaving streaks in the soot. I like the sink, she said. It feels old. Everything here feels old, Evan muttered, though he was studying the ceiling beams with interest. They were thick and straight, the kind of lumber you couldn't buy in a hardware store anymore. Claire saw it too, beneath the scars. The structure had been built with care, with an eye toward permanence. They ended their circuit back in the hallway, where the front staircase rose in a curve to the second floor. The balustrade was blackened, but still solid under Claire's hand when she tested it. The steps themselves were littered with plaster dust and bits of charred wood from the floor above, but they didn't sag or shift under weight. She caught Evan's eye, and he gave a small nod. Picking up a small piece of glass that had fused into an amber droplet, she held it up to the light, fascinated. It's like the house is keeping pieces of the fire. It was all damage, yes, but it was also evidence of what had survived. Even stripped to its skeleton in places, the craftsmanship showed through in the symmetry of the window frames. The precise joinery of the trim, the weight of the doors, still hanging straight on their hinges. She could feel it under her feet and in her hands. In the quiet way, the house seemed to hold its ground against time, when they stepped back onto the porch. The sunlight felt brighter than it had before. Claire glanced over her shoulder one more time before pulling the plywood back into place. For the first time since the auction, she wasn't just wondering what she'd gotten herself into, she was wondering what it might look like when it was whole again. Then the others, almost like it had been added as an afterthought. The walls here were stripped bare, the lath showing in long vertical lines, and the light from the nearest window barely reached past the doorway. Claire moved slowly, her boots scraping against the warped boards. The air colder here than in the rest of the house, the smell of smoke was fainter, replaced by a dampness that carried a hint of metal. Evan and Mara trailed behind her, their voices hushed, as if the hallway itself was listening at the end of the passage. The boards stopped, and a section of poured concrete took their place. Claire frowned, stepping forward. She could feel the temperature drop again under her hand when she touched the wall. Then she saw a steel door set into the far wall. The frame sunk deep into the concrete, as if it had been designed to withstand more than just weather. The handle was a solid bar, dull with age but unbent, and just above it sat a lock unlike anything she had seen in a residence. It was square, heavy, and fitted with a keyhole that looked more suited for a vault than a basement. Around the edges of the door, the steel was scorched in places, as if the fire had licked at it and given up. Mara stepped closer, her small hand hovering just above the surface. "It's not burned," she said, her voice low. "Burn this," Evan replied, running his fingers along the outer edge of the frame. He knocked against it lightly, and the sound was deep, resonant, like striking the side of a large drum. "It's solid and old." Claire crouched to look at the base of the door. No signs of rust along the hinge line, no swelling from moisture. Whatever had been built here had been built to last. She thought about the rest of the basement she'd glimpsed from the outside boarded windows at ground level. No other visible entrances. Whoever installed this hadn't wanted casual visitors. She tried the handle out of habit. It didn't. The metal was cool against her palm, the movement restricted by the lock that sat heavy in the door. Like a warning, she stepped back, feeling that faint pressure in her chest she'd felt when Mrs. Keating had spoken about the basement. "Always locked," she'd said. Guarded. Evan was peering at the hinges now, following the seam where steel met. "Concrete. You'd need tools to get through this," he said. He trailed off, his gaze flicking to hers. Claire straightened and looked at the rest of the hallway. The damage here was minimal, a few blackened, boards near the ceiling, plaster fallen in small chunks on the floor, but nothing like the devastation upstairs. It was as if the fire had reached this far and stopped. She wondered if it was because of the steel, whether the heat and flames had been repelled by it, leaving whatever was on the other side untouched. Mara crouched beside the door and pointed to the floor. "There's no gap," she said. Claire saw what she meant. The steel met the concrete so precisely there was no space for light or air to pass through. The door was part of the wall, as though the whole thing had been poured and set in one piece. The three of them stood there for a while, the only sound the faint drip of water somewhere deeper in the house. Claire found herself imagining what could be on the other side. Storage, maybe, but no one built a vault door for jars of peaches and old holiday decorations. Her mind moved through possibilities, valuables, records, something from the Whitcomb family's past that they'd wanted to keep from prying eyes. She reached out once more. Pressing her palm flat against the steel, it felt steady, unyielding. In a house where so much had been damaged, twisted, and broken, this was the one thing that had endured without a mark. That alone made it seem important. "We'll have to figure it out," she said finally, more to herself than to the kids. One way or another, Evan's brow furrowed. "You think there's something in there worth all this?" Claire glanced back at the door. "I think someone went to a lot of trouble to keep people out," she said. "And I'd like to know why." They left the hallway in silence, the image of the door following Claire into the brighter rooms of the house. It was a weight now, somewhere in the back of her mind, a puzzle she hadn't chosen but couldn't stop thinking about, holding whatever it guarded as tightly as it had for decades. The piano sat alone in what had once been the front parlor, its blackened frame slumped as though the heat of the fire had made it buckle inward. The varnish had bubbled and peeled in places, curling away to reveal raw wood beneath, while several of the ivory keys had split down the middle, jagged like broken teeth. Claire had noticed it the first time they walked through, but she'd been too focused on keeping the children from stepping on loose nails to pay it much attention. Now, with the light slanting in through the fractured windows, it seemed to hold a kind of stubborn presence, a relic too heavy for anyone to bother removing. Mara was the first to approach. She set her sketchbook on the sill and leaned over the keyboard, pressing one of the unburned keys. The sound that came out was a warped metallic twang, like a guitar string pulled too far and left to rust. She tried another, then another, until Evan shot her a look. "It's probably full of mice," he muttered. But he didn't stop her. Claire crossed the room, picking her way over a scatter of plaster fragments. She ran her fingers along the edge of the piano lid. It was stuck, fused to the body, where the heat had warped the wood. She could feel grit under her palm, the residue of soot and years of dust. Mara crouched down to peer underneath, her head tilting in that way she had when she was looking for something small. "It's caught on something," Mara said, reaching under the side. She pulled back immediately, brushing soot from her fingertips. "There's metal back here." Evan stepped closer, dropping to one knee beside her. "Probably part of the frame," he said, but his voice carried the same curiosity. Together, they shifted the piano a few inches from the wall, the legs scraping against the warped boards. Dust billowed up, bringing with it the faint, stale smell of ashes. Mara reached again, this time with both hands, and when she pulled back, she held something that caught the light. It was a key, heavy, longer than her palm, and made of tarnished brass. The bow was round and thick, but along the edges were strange etchings, shapes that curled and intersected in patterns she didn't recognize. Near the tip, the metal was warped and darkened, as though it had been close enough to the fire to partially melt, but not destroy it. Claire took it carefully, feeling the unexpected weight. It was no ordinary house key. The shaft was thick, the teeth broad and uneven, and the metal was warm from Mara's hands. She turned it over, tracing the etchings with her thumb. They weren't letters, not in any language she knew, and they didn't seem random either. The lines formed loops and angles, some symmetrical, others broken, as if part of them had been worn away. "What do you think it opens?" Mara asked, leaning closer to study it. Claire glanced toward the back hallway, toward the memory of the steel door they'd found earlier. She didn't want to say it out loud yet, didn't want to spark too much expectation, but the thought was immediate. The lock on that door had been industrial, square, and old. A key like this might not fit a modern lock, but it seemed possible it had been made for something equally stubborn. Evan took the key from her and turned it over in his hands. "This is weird," he said. "It feels handmade, not like anything you'd buy in a store." He tapped the etchings with one finger. "And these look like, I don't know, symbols. Could be decoration," Claire said, though she didn't quite believe it. The patterns seemed purposeful, like they might be part of a larger design. She imagined the person who had made it, working the brass until it matched some precise intention. Mara smiled, a quick flash of excitement. "Maybe it's for the basement door," she said. "It looks like it belongs there." Claire hesitated. "Maybe," she allowed. She didn't want to feed the children's eagerness until she knew more. Still, the weight of the key in her hand sent a small current of anticipation through her. It had been hidden behind a piano that no one had moved in years, in a house where certain parts had been guarded even before the fire. That didn't feel accidental. She slipped it into her coat pocket, the brass pressing against the fabric like a reminder. They pushed the piano back into place, though it left fresh grooves in the floorboards, and the room returned to its previous silence. Dust floated in the cold light, settling slowly on the warped keys as they moved on through the house. Claire kept her hand in her pocket, fingers resting against the key's smooth, warm curve. Whatever it had opened once, it might still open again, and she had a feeling it wasn't going to be something simple. The hallway felt even narrower the second time they walked it, the air denser somehow, as though the steel door at the end was pulling all the space toward itself. Claire's footsteps sounded louder than she intended, her boots thudding on the concrete patch that marked the final few feet. Evan carried the flashlight he'd found in the glove compartment of the car, its beam sharp and narrow in the dim light. Mara followed close behind, her eyes fixed on the dark rectangle that waited for them. The lock was still as they'd left it square, heavy, indifferent to their curiosity. Claire ran her hand over the surface again, the soot smearing across her fingertips. She crouched without thinking, her attention drawn to the thin sliver of darkness at the base where the steel met the concrete floor. It was almost flush, but not entirely. There was just enough of a gap to suggest the faintest passage of air from whatever space lay beyond. Evan knelt beside her, angling the flashlight toward the opening. The beam spilled into the gap and was swallowed quickly, but not completely. Shadows resolved into shapes, sharp and geometric, against the floor. He shifted the angle slightly, and something caught a faint, dull reflection. "I can see something," he murmured. Claire leaned in, her cheek almost brushing the cold steel. "What, metal?" Evan said after a pause. "Like rows of it. Cabinets, maybe? They look tall, too tall for shelves." Mara crouched on his other side, trying to peer into the narrow opening. "How can you tell they're lined up?" Evan said. "Like in a school storage room, but they're all the same height, and the light's hitting the edges. Looks like, I don't know, filing cabinets. The old kind. The handles shine a little when I move the light." Claire imagined them rows of identical metal cabinets sealed behind this vault-like door for who knew how many years. They didn't fit with the image of a typical basement. No coal bins, no racks of tools, no sagging wooden shelves filled with jars of preserves. These were organized, deliberate, industrial. She straightened, glancing down the hallway toward the rest of the house. The sound here was different. When they spoke, their voices didn't carry far, muffled by the heavy door and the concrete. She wondered how deep the basement went, and whether the cabinets had been there before the Whitcombs lived in the house, or if they had installed them for some purpose of their own. Evan slid the flashlight back into his pocket and sat back on his heels. "It's weird," he said. "There's no dust in there, or not much. You'd think after the fire." He let the thought trail off. "Steel door like this probably kept the smoke out," Claire said. "And the heat, mostly. It might have stayed sealed the whole time." Mara frowned. "So why lock it? Why not just leave it empty?" "That's the question," Claire replied. She found herself thinking of the key Mara had pulled from behind the piano, the brass etched with symbols that felt more than decorative. She had slipped it into her coat pocket again before they left the car today, unable to shake the sense that it belonged somewhere in this house. She touched it now through the fabric, the cool outline pressing into her palm. "What if it fits?" Mara asked suddenly, her eyes flicking from the key-shaped bulge in Claire's pocket to the lock on the door. Claire hesitated. Part of her wanted to try it, if only to know, but another part held back. She wasn't ready for whatever might be waiting on the other side, not without a plan. If the door opened, she didn't know what condition the stairs would be in, or whether the air down there would even be safe to breathe. "Not yet," she said finally. "We'll check the rest of the house first, make sure we know what we're walking into." Evan didn't argue, but his expression told her he'd already decided he wanted to see inside sooner rather than later. He ran his hand over the door one more time before standing. The steel seemed to drink in the light, its surface dull and matte, except where the soot had been disturbed. They turned to leave, but as they stepped back into the brighter rooms, Claire glanced over her shoulder. The door stood in shadow, the narrow strip at its base glowing faintly in her memory from the flashlight's beam. Rows of metal cabinets lined up like silent sentinels, waiting in the dark. Whatever was in them had been sealed away for decades, guarded by steel, concrete, and secrecy. She didn't know if the key in her pocket would open that lock, but she knew she wouldn't be able to ignore it for long. The door would wait, as it had all these years. But the thought of those hidden rows was already following her, a quiet pull at the back of her mind. The records office was housed in a squat brick building off Main Street, its front steps worn to shallow dips by decades of foot traffic. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish, with the muffled hum of a space heater somewhere in the corner. Claire signed her name on the visitor's log and was led by a clerk to a back room lined with tall metal filing cabinets, each drawer labeled with narrow strips of yellowed paper. The woman who had greeted her, a quiet, bird-like clerk named Denise, explained that property deeds and tax records for the town went back to the late 1800s. She gestured toward a long counter where a stack of request slips sat beside a pot of ballpoint pens. Claire filled one out with the house's address, the numbers feeling strange under her pen after so many weeks of thinking of it as only the ruin. Denise took the slip, disappeared into the rows of cabinets, and returned a few minutes later with a thin folder that looked as though it hadn't been handled in years. The folder was brittle at the edges, the manila darkened by time. Claire carried it to a nearby table and eased it open. Inside were half a dozen documents, each on thick paper, with neat looping script in black ink. The earliest was a deed dated 1894, transferring the property from a lumber merchant to a man named Jonas Whitcomb. The name stirred nothing at first, but as she read further, she began to understand why it sounded faintly familiar. A newspaper clipping, folded in quarters and tucked behind the deeds, bore the heading "Local Inventor" to exhibit at State Fair. The article described Whitcomb as a private and industrious man who maintained a workshop on the premises and whose mechanical designs had drawn interest from industrial men in Boston. There was no photograph, only the words, but they painted a picture of someone precise, methodical, and guarded. A later page in the file was a tax ledger, listing paid amounts year after year in a neat hand until 1911. That year, the notation in the margin simply read "uncollected." The next entry showed the town seizing the property for unpaid taxes the following spring. There was no explanation, no probate file, no record of a sale to settle debts. It was as though Jonas Whitcomb had simply stepped away from his house and never returned. Claire turned back to the article, reading it again with the knowledge of that abrupt ending. The workshop mentioned must have been in the house. In the basement, she thought of the steel door and the rows of cabinets Evan had glimpsed. If Whitcomb had been a man who worked with machines, perhaps the basement had been his storage or a vault for unfinished designs. But then, why lock it so heavily? Denise reappeared at her side, holding a thin gray index card. "Found this in the archives catalog," she said, setting it down. It was typed, the keys uneven in pressure, the edges of the card curling. At the top was Whitcomb's name, beneath it, missing person. Presumed deceased with the date August 14th, 1911. No cause, no details. Just a note that the case had been closed by the county for lack of evidence. "Do you know what happened to him?" Claire asked. Denise shook her head. "Old-timers used to say he went to Boston on business and never came back. Others thought he got lost in the woods or went off the road in winter. No one ever found anything." Claire slipped the clipping and the index card back into the folder, her fingers lingering on the brittle edges. She imagined the man in his workshop, the hiss of an oil lamp, the smell of metal shavings and grease. Somewhere between the day of the fair and the summer of 1911, whatever had driven him vanished along with him. She signed the checkout log for a photocopy of the deed and the article, sliding them carefully into her bag. Outside the afternoon, light was thin and cold, the snow along the curb gray with road salt. The car's heater clicked as she started it, but her thoughts were elsewhere, tracing the outline of a man she had never met, but whose absence still clung to the house she now owned. The Whitcomb name might have faded from the town's daily memory, but it was still there, sealed in the steel and concrete under her feet. Whatever Jonas had been building or hiding was still waiting in the basement. As untouched as the day the door was closed, the locksmith arrived in a battered white van with faded lettering on the side, the kind that suggested decades of business without much concern for appearances. He was a tall man in his 60s, with a lined face and a quiet, deliberate way of moving. Claire had called him 2 days earlier, explaining only that she needed help opening a heavy old lock in a house she'd bought at auction. She didn't mention the fire or the smell of soot that still lingered in every room. Inside, he set down his tool bag on the scorched hardwood, taking in the hallway without comment. His eyes moved over the blackened walls, the warped door frames, the remnants of plaster clinging stubbornly in patches. She led him toward the back of the house where the steel door waited, the brass key in her hand. When he saw the door, he stopped a few feet short, tilting his head slightly. The hinges were thick and reinforced, bolted into the surrounding frame in a way that made them look more suited to a bank vault than a private home. He stepped closer, running his fingers along the cold surface, then crouched to inspect the keyhole. Claire handed him the key. He turned it over in his palm, examining the half-melted etchings. The metal was heavier than it should have been, the edges worn smooth by time rather than use. He ran a thumb over one of the symbols, his brow furrowing. "This isn't standard," he murmured, almost to himself. "Not for anything I've seen in a house." She asked if it would fit. He didn't answer immediately, instead taking a small flashlight from his bag and shining it into the keyhole. The beam revealed nothing more than a deep, shadowed cylinder. But his expression tightened. "I can open it," he said finally, his voice low. "It might take some time, but you sure you want to?" The question caught her off guard. Why wouldn't I? He glanced up at her, the light from the flashlight cutting across his face. Whoever put this in wasn't trying to keep out. Burglars. This is deliberate. Industrial. You see these hinges? That's not for privacy. That's for containment. The word lingered between them, and Claire found herself picturing the rows of metal cabinets Evan had glimpsed through the gap. Containment could mean anything: chemicals, valuables, even dangerous equipment. The locksmith rose to his feet, still holding the key. I've been at this 40 years. I've opened panic rooms, old bank boxes, safes from before the Depression. I've never seen this combination of materials and design in a residential door. If it were me, he handed the key back, closing her fingers around it. I'd leave it alone. She studied his face, looking for signs of exaggeration, but his expression was flat, almost unreadable. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a measured caution, the way someone might look at a frozen lake in early spring. What do you think is down there? She asked. He shook his head. Not my place to guess. My job is to open what people ask me to open. But I've learned that sometimes doors get closed for a reason, and sometimes that reason's better left in the past. With that, he began packing his tools, even though he hadn't touched the lock. She watched him work, the clink of metal on metal, oddly loud in the stillness of the ruined hallway. When he was finished, he gave a short nod and left without asking for payment, saying only, "Call me if you change your mind." The sound of his van starting drifted away down the street, leaving the house in its usual hush. Claire stood there. For a long time, the brass key warm from her grip. She looked at the steel door again, its surface catching the weak afternoon light, and felt the weight of choice settle over her. The lock hadn't opened, but it was no longer just a was an unanswered question, and questions had a way of demanding answers. The key turned with a resistance that felt almost alive, a grinding reluctance deep in the mechanism. Claire had to brace herself, both hands on the heavy brass, before the tumblers gave way with a muted clunk that seemed far too loud in the silent hallway. The steel door shuddered once as she pulled, its hinges groaning like a long-forgotten gate. A stale breath of air escaped from the opening, and it was colder than she expected, cold in a way that didn't belong to summer, or even to the remnants of a burned-out house. The gap widened, revealing a narrow flight of concrete stairs that dropped steeply into a blackness so complete it seemed to swallow the light from above. The steps were unadorned, poured directly into the foundation, their edges chipped and uneven. The handrail was an iron pipe, slick with condensation, and when she touched it, a chill traveled up her arm. Evan leaned in beside her, peering down into the void. "It's like a freezer," he said, his breath faintly visible in the air between them. Mara stood farther back, hugging herself, her eyes darting between the doorway and the rest of the house as, if half expecting something to emerge from below, Claire switched on the flashlight she had brought, its beam catching swirls of dust that hung unmoving in the frigid air. The light cut across the first few steps, then disappeared into the deeper shadows. She took a cautious step forward, the sound of her shoe against the concrete sharp and hollow. The air smelled faintly metallic, like wet iron left out in the rain. But underneath it was something else, an old, almost earthy scent, as though the basement had been sealed for a century without ever being touched. With each step downward, the temperature dropped further. It wasn't the damp chill of an ordinary cellar. It was the kind of penetrating cold that made her fingertips ache around the flashlight. The sound of their movements changed. The creak and groan of the house above faded, replaced by the low hum of silence that came from being deep underground. Halfway down, she paused to look back. From here, the doorway to the main floor seemed far away, the pale rectangle of light shrinking against the dark walls. The steel door loomed in her mind, and she had the odd thought that if it swung shut now, no one outside would ever hear them. They reached the bottom, where the concrete gave way to a smooth floor, cool beneath her shoes. The flashlight swept across bare walls, thick and windowless, with no sign of mold or water damage, despite the years of abandonment. It was as if the space had been protected from the fire, from weather, from time itself. The beam caught something reflective in the far corner rows of tall metal cabinets, just as Evan had glimpsed through the gap weeks earlier. Their surfaces were unmarked, the steel clean and cold. Each had a heavy latch, secured with a small, round keyhole. There were dozens of them, arranged in neat lines. like an archive or storage vault. Claire's breath slowed as she walked between them. The air was still, but the cold pressed against her skin, making her want to rub her arms for warmth. The sound of their footsteps echoed faintly, the cabinets giving back a soft metallic ring. Mara stayed close to her side, eyes darting toward the shadows between the rows. Near the center of the room stood a workbench, its surface covered with a thin layer of dust. She set the flashlight down on it, the beam sweeping upward to reveal shelves above, empty now, but marked with faint outlines where objects had once rested. On the far wall, a second door sat flush with the concrete, smaller and without a handle. Evan moved toward it, but Claire stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the unnatural cold, or the memory of the locksmith's warning, or simply the feeling that they had crossed into a space meant to be hidden. The small door was different from the rest of the basement, its surface made of the same steel as the cabinets, but thicker. Reinforced at the edges, she retrieved the flashlight and swept it once more around the room, her breath curling in the dim light. The cabinets stood in perfect order, silent and waiting, each lock identical. The cold seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, steady and unchanging, as though the basement existed in its own season, untouched by the world above. Finally turned to climb back up, the beam of the flashlight trembled slightly in her hand. The stairs seemed steeper on the way out, the doorway farther away than she remembered. At the top, the warmer air of the ruined hallway closed around them, and she realized her fingers were stiff and numb. Claire shut the steel door gently, but it closed with a sound like a vault ceiling. She left it unlocked, though the weight of it felt final, as if opening it again would be harder, not because of the lock, but because of the choice. The beam of the flashlight swept slowly across the room, catching the dull gleam of steel in every direction. Claire realized then that the glimpse Evan had caught under the door hadn't exaggerated the number of cabinets. If anything, it had underestimated them. Row after row of tall filing cabinets stretched out in rigid lines, each one the same height, the same dull gray, their metal faces reflecting the light in muted flashes. Every drawer was secured with a heavy padlock, the kind with a hardened shackle and thick body, and not one of them showed signs of rust. They were arranged with an almost military precision, the lines so straight that it looked as if someone had measured every inch of space. The cabinets were set close enough together that a person had to turn sideways to pass between them, but wide enough to allow a flashlight beam to run down the length of a row uninterrupted. Claire reached out to touch one and felt an instant bite of cold metal through her fingertips, sharper than the chill in the air. She pulled her hand back instinctively, rubbing her fingers against her palm. Evan's sneakers squeaked faintly on the concrete as he walked down one of the aisles, brushing the side of a cabinet with his sleeve. "They're all locked," he said after a moment, trying one of the padlocks and finding it immovable. The clink of the metal against metal sounded loud in the otherwise still space. Mara hung back near the stairs, glancing toward the door. As though keeping a mental path to escape, Claire moved deeper into the room, letting the light skim over the tops of the cabinets. A thin layer of dust coated them, but it wasn't the thick, undisturbed blanket she might have expected. Instead, the dust seemed uneven in places, as though something or someone had moved among them long after the fire upstairs. The thought tightened something in her chest. Each padlock was identical, the metal smooth, the keyhole small and round. There were no tags, no markings to suggest what was inside. If they had labels once, they had been removed long ago, leaving only faint discolorations on the steel. She tried lifting the corner of one cabinet to test its weight, but it didn't budge. Whatever they held inside wasn't paper alone. At the far end of the room, a single cabinet stood slightly apart from the others, set against the wall rather than in line with the rows. Its padlock was newer, the brass still bright compared to the darkened steel around it. Claire crouched to examine it, feeling the coolness radiate even more strongly here. She pressed her ear to the metal, absurdly hoping to hear some clue, but there was nothing, only the silence that had settled. Deep into the basement walls, Evan's voice echoed softly from between the rows. He was counting them, his voice growing fainter as he moved. 36, 37, 38. He emerged on the far side, shaking his head. 42 in total. That's a lot of whatever this is. His tone was half Wonder, half unease, Claire thought of the records she'd found at Town Hall, the name Jonas Whitcomb, and the lack of any inventory of his possessions. It was possible that these cabinets contained the answer to who he was and what he had been doing. Here, but the locks were deliberate, and the effort to secure so many suggested a purpose beyond simple storage. She tried one more padlock, tugging hard, but the shackle didn't give. The air felt heavier between the cabinets, as if the steel absorbed the cold and returned it in a steady, unyielding wave. Her breath left a faint fog in front of her as she turned in place, sweeping the light slowly, letting it linger on the uniform faces of the cabinets. Mara's voice broke the stillness. Why would anyone lock them all? She was standing just at the edge of the first row, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Claire didn't have an answer. She could only feel the weight of the locked drawers pressing in from all sides, each one a question without a key. The three of them stood there for a long moment, the flashlight beam cutting across cold metal, the sound of their breathing filling the space. Claire knew they would leave the basement tonight without opening a single one, but the image of the cabinets would follow her upstairs and linger long after they shut the door. The box was tucked behind the farthest row of cabinets, wedged into the corner where the wall met the floor. Claire might have missed it entirely if the beam of the flashlight hadn't caught the faint ripple of dull metal beneath a scatter of debris. It looked like it had been dented on one side, the lid slightly bowed, but the clasp was still intact. She crouched and brushed away the dust, leaving faint streaks on the cold surface, and lifted it into the light. The weight surprised her. Whatever was inside wasn't loose, or rattling it had a steady heaviness, as if it contained something solid and important. She set the box on the floor and knelt beside it, her knees pressing into the cool concrete. Evan hovered over her shoulder while Mara hung back near the first row of cabinets, the beam from her smaller flashlight darting across the ceiling as though she half expected something to move there. Claire unclipped the clasp, the metal giving a reluctant snap before releasing. The lid lifted stiffly, and the smell of old leather and paper drifted up, faint but distinct even in the chill air. Inside lay a single object, a leather-bound book, its cover darkened with age but still supple. The edges of the pages were uneven, and the spine bore faint impressions where it had been handled again and again. She lifted it carefully, feeling the weight of it settle into her palms. The cover was unmarked, no title, no name, only a faint embossing near one corner. Too worn to make out, she opened it to the first page. The paper was thick, the surface rough under her fingertips, and every line was filled in with neat, deliberate handwriting. Columns of numbers ran down the left side, paired with cryptic sets of initials that repeated in irregular intervals. Some entries were crossed out with a single line, others circled. Between the columns, tiny sketches filled the margins, precise drawings of gears, pistons, and odd shapes she couldn't immediately identify. A few were labeled with single words in the same sharp script: regulator, coupling, prototype. Evan leaned closer. "What is this? Like blueprints?" His voice was low, almost as if speaking louder might disturb the fragile order of the pages. Claire turned a few more, finding that the pattern repeated numbers, initials, more sketches. Some pages included faint stains, as though a drop of oil or grease had fallen there decades ago. In one section, a series of diagrams unfolded across 3 pages, each showing what looked like the same machine from different angles. There were no dates, no obvious indication of what the ledger documented, but something about the precision suggested it was more than personal notes. This was record-keeping with a purpose. She remembered the name from the property records. Jonas Whitcomb, and felt certain this had been his hand at work. Whoever he had been, he was meticulous, almost obsessive. Toward the middle of the book, the entries shifted. The numbers grew larger, and some of the initials changed. In the margins, the machinery sketches gave way to what looked like floor plans, each with small X marks in various places. One diagram in particular caught her eye. It appeared to be the outline of a room, almost identical in size and shape to the basement they stood in now, with rows of rectangles that could have been cabinets. Mara edged closer, drawn in despite herself. "That's this place," she said quietly. Claire nodded, feeling the same realization settle in. If the drawings were accurate, then the cabinets had been here long before the fire, maybe even before the house above had taken its final form. Last pages were different. The handwriting grew tighter, more hurried. The numbers no longer formed perfect columns, but angled slightly, as though written in haste. The initials dwindled until only a few repeated over and over. And at the bottom of the very last page, there was a small symbol, an interlocking pattern of circles and lines that looked more like something from an old seal than a casual doodle dot. Claire closed the ledger and ran her hand over the cover again, feeling the worn ridges beneath her fingertips. The chill in the basement seemed to press in closer, the silent weight of the cabinets surrounding them. Whatever this book recorded, it had been worth hiding behind rows of locked steel and leaving in a dented box for who knew how many decades. She wasn't sure yet if finding it was the beginning of an answer, the start of a much bigger question. Mrs. Keating stood on her porch in a heavy cardigan, her hands wrapped around a mug that had long since stopped steaming, over to return a borrowed ladder. But the moment Whitcomb's name slipped into the conversation, the older woman's expression changed. She glanced up and down the quiet street before leaning against the railing, her voice lowering as though the air itself might be listening. She said there were stories, old ones, that no one wrote down but everyone in town used to whisper about. Jonas Whitcomb, she claimed, hadn't just been some eccentric tinkerer. He was a man sitting on ideas decades ahead of his time, ideas that, if they'd stayed his, could have changed everything for him and the town. Claire listened, the ladder balanced against her shoulder, as Mrs. Keating recounted how, in the early 1900s, Whitcomb had been seen bringing strange machines into the house, parts that no one in the local shops sold. He had shipments coming in from New York and Boston crates delivered at night, their contents carried quickly inside. A few trusted workmen were paid in cash to help move the heavier pieces, but none of them ever saw the full machines assembled. They only knew that Whitcomb kept his workshop sealed and that he sometimes disappeared for days, only to reappear with grease on his hands and a look in his eyes like he'd seen something no one else could. Then, one winter, everything changed. A traveling businessman from Chicago came to town and was seen dining with Whitcomb in the back room of the local inn. After that, more strangers began arriving, men in long coats, the kind who didn't mingle. The rumor, Mrs. Keating said, was that Whitcomb had been pressured, or maybe tricked, into showing his work. Within months, patents began appearing in the names of companies in New York, Detroit, and Pittsburgh, designs for machines that sounded eerily like the ones Whitcomb was said to be building in secret. Engines with unheard of efficiency, tools that could cut steel faster than anything on the market, even a type of generator that could run without coal for extended periods. People in town started to notice that Whitcomb no longer walked with the same upright posture. He still bought supplies, but less often. His hair grew longer, his clothes more unkempt. Neighbors who had once seen the warm glow of light through his workshop windows now saw only darkness. By the spring of 1911, he had vanished entirely. No note, no will, nothing. The property sat locked for years until it passed into distant hands. Mrs. Keating sipped from her mug, eyes fixed on the street rather than on Claire. They say, the men who stole from him made fortunes, she said. Factories rose up, stocks climbed, and not one mention of Jonas Whitcomb in the papers. That's how those stories die. They get replaced by the names people are allowed to. Remember, she added that her grandmother used to swear the real plants' originals had never left this house, that Whitcomb had hidden them after realizing what was happening. Knowing the thieves couldn't take what they couldn't find, Claire thought of the ledger in the basement, of the sketches and the columns of numbers, of the floor plan that matched, the room filled with locked cabinets. If Whitcomb had hidden anything, the basement was the obvious place. And if those cabinets contained the missing designs, then she was standing over something that history had buried twice, once in the fire, and once in the theft. Mrs. Keating must have seen the flicker of calculation in her eyes, because she set her mug down and straightened. "I'm telling you this because I like you, Claire," she said, her tone firm now. "But you have 2 children, and people have done worse than start fires over less than what you might have down there. If there's truth to the old rumor, you'll have more than just curious neighbors watching you." The late afternoon light was slipping toward dusk, casting long shadows across the street. Claire shifted the ladder in her grip, aware of the weight of the conversation and of the thin, cold line it had drawn through the center of her thoughts. She thanked Mrs. Keating and walked back toward the house, each step pressing the question deeper into her mind. There, could she protect them more? Would finding them simply paint a target she couldn't erase? Claire noticed the sleek black SUV before she noticed the man leaning against it. The vehicle was far too polished for the cracked asphalt of her driveway, its tinted windows swallowing the reflection of the burned house behind her. She had just come back from the hardware store with Evan and Mara when he stepped forward, a practiced smile on his face. He was dressed in a dark wool coat, scarf tucked neatly at the collar. Leather gloves still on, despite the mild afternoon chill. "Claire Donovan?" he asked, his voice smooth, like someone used to closing deals in hotel conference rooms and private offices. When she nodded, he reached into his coat and pulled out a slim business card, handing it over with the kind of confidence that assumed she'd keep it. Adam Harlow. The name was printed in understated silver letters, with a phone number, no company. Logo? He said he was a local developer, mostly residential projects, though his cadence suggested that was a deliberate understatement. He glanced up at the blackened facade of the house, his eyes moving quickly across the boarded windows and the sagging eaves. "You've got quite a place here," he said, pausing just long enough for the words to sound almost like a compliment. Claire asked how he knew her name. He chuckled, explaining that the county auction wasn't exactly private and that properties like hers drew certain kinds of interest. Before she could ask what that meant, he stepped closer, lowering his voice. He said he'd be willing to take the lot off her hands for $50,000 cash, no agents, no paperwork, beyond the bare minimum. The offer was generous, he insisted, given the state of the structure and the risks of trying to rebuild. Evan shifted beside her, frowning while Mara clung to the paper bag holding their groceries. Claire kept her expression neutral, though inside she felt the prickle of unease. Harlow spoke with the same tone as someone pointing out a flaw in a car they wanted to buy cheap. Casual, but with a sharp edge beneath. He told her the fire had compromised more than the framing, that water damage alone could cost her more than the property was worth. "Frankly," he said, "you'd be doing yourself a favor walking away now before it becomes a sinkhole for your savings." Claire asked him why he'd want to buy it at all if it was so worthless. That earned her a small, almost amused smirk. "Location," he replied simply, gesturing to the surrounding street. "A quiet neighborhood, easy access to the main road. Tear this down, you've got a blank slate, the kind of thing people pay for." When she didn't respond right away, he added that he'd heard there were complications with the property's history, wording vague, enough to sound harmless, but pointed enough to land. He didn't elaborate, but the way his gaze lingered on her told her he was fishing for a reaction. She gave him none. Harlow pulled a thick envelope from his coat pocket, held it up just enough for her to see the edges of bills inside. $50,000, he repeated. "You could be free of this place by the end of the week." His smile didn't reach his eyes. Evan took a step forward before Claire put a hand on his arm. She looked at Harlow and told him she wasn't interested. Not now, not later. His smile froze for a moment, then softened again, though the air between them felt heavier. He slipped the envelope back into his coat, said she should think about it, and left his card in her hand. She watched the SUV pull away, the sound of its tires fading down the street. Evan muttered that the man gave him a bad feeling. Mara asked if they were in trouble. Claire didn't answer immediately. She slipped the card into her pocket, aware of the basement door waiting in the dark of the house, and the ledger locked in her desk upstairs. The offer wasn't about the lot. She was certain of that now. It was about whatever was still hidden. Here and the people who wanted it badly enough to show up uninvited. The discovery came late in the afternoon, when the low winter lights slipped through the gaps in the charred window frames and cast thin, pale stripes across the basement stairs. Evan had been down there twice already that day, restless and curious, pacing between the locked cabinets, while Claire sorted through a pile of salvaged tools upstairs. He had the flashlight in one hand, its beam slicing through the cold air. When he stopped mid-step, on the far wall, the concrete support beam caught his attention, not because of its shape, but because of the faint, deliberate groove cut into its surface. He crouched, brushing away a thin crust of dust and spiderwebs, and there it was. The same curved and angled design that was burned into his memory from the brass key Mara had found. A looping arc intersected by 3 short lines, enclosed in what looked like a misshapen hexagon. He called for Claire. his voice echoing against the concrete, but she didn't hear him over the sound of shifting boards upstairs. He swung the light farther along the beam and froze again. There was another symbol, nearly identical, carved deeper into the concrete. Then another, spaced evenly beside it. Evan moved slowly, sweeping the flashlight along the length of the wall. The markings repeated at regular intervals, as if someone had stamped them into the wet cement before it hardened. Each one was at the same height, each one perfectly aligned. It wasn't random graffiti, and it wasn't damage from the fire. These had been here since the basement was first built. He crossed to the opposite wall, running his fingers over the rough surface. More of them? Not just on the walls, but etched into the bases of the thick vertical beams that supported the main floor. The repetition made the space feel smaller, more deliberate, like the basement was a part of something engineered rather than just a storage space. When Claire finally descended the stairs, Evan didn't say anything at first. He simply pointed, the light at the nearest beam, waiting for her to recognize it. She leaned closer, wiping at the symbol with the cuff of her sleeve. The lines were shallow but sharp, the work of a tool that had left no hesitation in its strokes. Her gaze flicked to him, and he could tell she knew exactly what it reminded her of. "It's the same as the key," she said quietly. They moved together, counting the number of symbols in the room. There were 24 in total, facing inward toward the center of the basement. Mara wandered down halfway through, clutching a sweater too big for her frame, and stood on the stairs watching them. She asked if the symbols meant the house belonged to someone important, or if it was a warning. Claire told her she didn't know, but her voice lacked conviction in the center of the basement, directly beneath the main support beam of the house. Evan noticed something else, a faint seam in the concrete floor, a straight line that cut across the dusty surface. It ran directly between two of the marked beams. The flashlight beam trembled slightly as he followed it with his eyes. The symbols weren't just decoration, they were positioned around something. Claire pressed her palm flat against one of the carvings, as if trying to feel something through. The air down there seemed heavier now, the quiet more intrusive, the locked cabinets, the reinforced basement door. The ledger upstairs, everything seemed to point toward a reason why this space had been sealed for decades. Evan knelt by the seam in the floor, running his fingers along it. Dust flaked away to reveal a slightly different texture beneath, like a panel or hatch disguised to match the rest of the slab. He didn't say anything, just glanced up at his mother. She met his gaze for a long moment before looking back at the walls, her eyes tracing the repeating symbols like she was trying to memorize them. When they climbed the stairs again, they left the basement light on. Neither of them mentioned the feeling that they hadn't simply been looking at markings on a wall, but at a language neither of them yet understood, a language carved into the bones of the house itself. The first cabinet they chose was one near the far wall. Its paint blistered from years of damp air, but the padlock still solid and rusted. Claire had borrowed a pry bar from the hardware store that morning, insisting on returning it in a single piece. Though she already suspected the lock wouldn't survive the day, Evan braced the cabinet with his shoulder while she wedged the flat end of the bar between the hasp and the steel door. The sound was sharp and metallic, each shove echoing through the basement like the ring of a struck pipe. Mara sat on the bottom step, hugging her knees, watching in silence. It took longer than Claire expected. The lock didn't snap so much, as it gave way reluctantly, bending the metal plate until it tore with a jolt. When the door creaked open, the hinges groaned in protest, revealing a narrow interior lined with shallow drawers stacked one above the other. Each had a small brass handle, tarnished almost too black, and each was secured with its own tiny lock. Claire felt a mix of frustration and curiosity, layers of security inside a basement that was already locked behind a steel door. She chose the top drawer, sliding the pry bar into the gap where the wood of the drawer front met the cabinet frame. The lock cracked with less resistance than the padlock had, and when she pulled, the drawer slid out smoothly, as if it had been oiled yesterday. Inside, wrapped in a sheet of yellowing oilcloth, was a tightly rolled tube of paper. Cloth smelled faintly of machine oil, a scent out of place in the otherwise dusty, cold air, unrolling it on the concrete floor. She realized it wasn't paper at all, but a kind of stiff drafting parchment, covered edge to edge with precise ink lines, measurements, and notes written in a neat, slanted hand. The drawing depicted a mechanical device unlike anything she recognized, a lattice of interlocking gears feeding into a large central cylinder, with a network of thin rods branching outward like the spokes of a wheel. Numbers annotated nearly every component, some accompanied by small sketches in the margins showing alternate configurations. Evan crouched beside her, tracing one finger just above the surface, careful not to touch the ink. "This looks old," he said, his voice low. He glanced toward the other drawers. "If there's one of these, there might be more." They opened the second drawer, then the third, each yielding more of the same. Dozens of rolled blueprints, some for devices that looked like advanced variations of the one in the first drawing. Others, completely different tangents, pulley systems, something that resembled a printing press, but with unfamiliar attachments. One sheet depicted a complicated series of curved blades connected to a crank system, with arrows indicating motion in ways that didn't make immediate sense. The handwriting was the same on all of them, and the name J. Whitcomb appeared in small, careful script at the bottom right corner of each page. Claire remembered the ledger upstairs, the columns of numbers and machine sketches, and the rumors Mrs. Keating had shared about stolen inventions. Here, tangible and deliberate, were the designs themselves preserved, locked away, hidden from whoever might have wanted them in the past. Mara slipped off the step and wandered closer, her eyes wide. She pointed at one blueprint that had a large oval frame and a system of springs inside. "It looks like a bed," she said, "but for something else." Claire didn't have an answer for her. She rolled the parchment carefully, wrapping it back in the oilcloth before placing it beside the others. They worked through half a dozen drawers before stopping, not because they had exhausted the cabinet, but because the weight of what they were finding began to settle over them. The designs weren't casual sketches. They were the kind of technical drawings that took weeks, even months, to perfect. Some of them had multiple revisions marked in red ink, with the earlier versions crossed out, but left visible. Claire sat back on her heels, glancing around the basement. The other cabinets, more than 20 of them, were identical, each with its own set of locked drawers. Then Jonas Whitcomb had created a body of work far greater than any local rumor could have hinted at. She wondered how many of these designs had been built, tested, or perhaps stolen before they were sealed away. Evan asked if they should take some upstairs, but Claire shook her head. For now, she wanted them to stay where they were. It wasn't just the risk of damaging them. It was the sense that moving them would be like waking something that had been sleeping for over a century. As they shut the damaged cabinet door, the clang echoed off the concrete walls. Above them, the daylight was already dimming, and the basement seemed to draw in more shadows with each passing minute. They left the blueprints rolled and returned to the stairs, each of them silently aware that this was only the beginning, that whatever Whitcomb had been building in secret had been more than just an eccentric hobby. It had been something worth hiding behind steel and locks, something someone had once been desperate to keep from the world. Claire hesitated before making the call, pacing the narrow strip of kitchen floor between the sink and the boarded-up window. The blueprints were still in the basement, where they had left them, rolled carefully in oilcloth, their existence already beginning to feel like a secret too large to keep. She'd taken a few photographs with her phone, nothing too detailed, just enough to show the age of the paper, the precision of the drawings, and the signatures scrawled in neat script, J. Whitcomb, when she finally sat at the table and searched. For someone who might understand what they had found, one name stood out: Dr. Lillian Rhodes, a professor of industrial history at the University of Vermont, with a list of publications on early American inventors and lost technologies. Her voice on the phone was clear and quick, the kind of tone that made Claire feel she was already 2 steps behind. At first, Dr. Rhodes was polite but reserved, asking standard questions: how Claire had come across the items, their condition, any known provenance. But when Claire mentioned the name Jonas Whitcomb, there was a pause. It was followed by an almost audible shift in her voice, as if she had just been handed the missing piece of a puzzle she'd been trying to solve for years. Claire sent the photographs while they spoke. The professor didn't even wait to finish the conversation. Before saying she would drive up that evening when Dr. Rhodes arrived, the late autumn sky was already sliding toward night. She was younger than Claire expected, her hair swept into a loose bun, her dark coat dusted with road salt from the drive. She didn't linger in the doorway, didn't make small talk. Her eyes swept the charred living room, the warped floorboards. And then she asked if she could see the basement immediately. Claire led her down the narrow concrete stairs, the flashlight beam bouncing along the walls. At the sight of the cabinet they had pried open, Dr. Rhodes stopped and pressed her hand lightly to the steel, almost reverently. Claire unrolled one of the blueprints on the floor. The professor knelt over it, her breath caught somewhere between awe and disbelief. She traced the ink lines in the air, not touching the paper, murmuring half-formed thoughts to herself. "These are intact," she finally said, her voice low. "Do you have any idea what this is?" Claire admitted she didn't, not beyond the rumors Mrs. Keating had shared. Dr. Rhodes sat back on her heels and explained that Whitcomb had been more than a local eccentric. In certain academic circles, he was considered one of the most promising, independent inventors of his era, someone whose work vanished abruptly and without explanation. There were whispers of patents that had never been filed, of prototypes seen once and then lost. "If these are authentic," she said, glancing toward the other locked cabinets, "this is the kind of archive people spend their lives trying to find." Her excitement was edged with unease. She asked if anyone else knew about the discovery. Claire mentioned the locksmith, the neighbor, and the developer who had appeared uninvited. Dr. Rhodes's expression tightened. She explained that industrial designs of this nature could still hold significant value, not just historically, but commercially. While many would see only antique curiosities, there were collectors, corporations, and even private research firms who might pay dearly for exclusive access to them. They spent another hour in the basement, opening 2 more drawers under the professor's careful direction. Each blueprint was examined, documented with photographs, and rewrapped. Dr. Rhodes handled them as though they were brittle leaves, her gloved fingers barely grazing the edges. She noted differences in the handwriting between some sheets, suggesting Whitcomb may have had assistants, perhaps apprentices, though no record of such people had survived in public archives. When they finally returned upstairs, the kitchen felt warmer, smaller, as if the weight of what lay below pressed upward through the floor. Dr. Rhodes took a long look at Claire. "You need to be cautious," she said. "This isn't the kind of find you announce. Not yet." She offered to help arrange secure storage for the blueprints, possibly even conservation work, but only if Claire trusted the people involved. "These things have a way of disappearing," she added, "especially when history and profit overlap." Claire agreed to think about it. Though the truth was, she already knew she wanted to keep control of the discovery. It wasn't just about ownership, it was about understanding why Whitcomb had locked it all away. Dr. Rhodes left with the promise to return in a few days. Her car's headlights. The afternoon light slanted in through the warped frame of the study window, catching floating dust in slow-moving shafts. The room had been one of the worst damaged by the fire. Its plaster walls bubbled and cracked, the built-in shelves blackened to a brittle charcoal. Claire had been pulling loose debris from the floor, while Evan worked on removing nails from a half-collapsed bookcase. Mara, restless and curious, moved along the far wall where the paint had blistered into strange patterns. She tapped at the paneling with the flat of her palm, the hollow thud immediately different from the dull solidity of the other sections. She froze, glancing back toward her mother. Claire looked up, brushing soot from her hands, and saw the way Mara's eyes were fixed on the wall. Without speaking, she crossed the room and tapped the same spot. The sound was undeniable. There was space behind it. Evan set down his hammer and joined them. Together, they felt along the seam where the wall met the floor and ceiling, looking for a latch or a break in the woodwork. The fire had warped much of it, and the once glossy finish was long gone, but a thin vertical gap was visible if you stood at the right angle. Claire fetched a pry bar from the hallway, slipping the flat edge into the gap. The panel resisted at first, as though it had not been touched in decades, but with steady pressure and a sudden creak, it shifted outward. The smell that escaped was musty, layered with the faint tang of aged oil. Behind the panel was a narrow cavity no deeper than the wall itself, lined with rough wood. Inside, neatly stacked on 2 shelves, were metal cylinders about the length of a forearm. Each one was wrapped tightly in waxed cloth, the ends sealed with what looked like hardened resin. Mara reached for one, but Claire stopped her, sliding on a pair of work gloves before lifting it from the shelf. It was heavier than it looked, the metal cool and smooth beneath the cloth. The wrapping was so precise it seemed almost ceremonial, as though whatever was inside was not just being stored, but preserved. Evan pulled out another, turning it over in his hands. The cylinders were identical in size, each marked with a faint number scratched into the metal beneath the wax. The numbering wasn't sequential. Instead, it seemed Code 3, A7F, 11C. They carried a few of them to the table they'd set up in the center of the study. Claire took a utility knife and carefully scored the wax cloth along one seam, peeling it back slowly. The resin at the ends cracked away with a faint snap, releasing a stronger scent of oil and something metallic, almost medicinal. A tightly rolled sheaf of papers, bound with a thin strip of leather. The edges of the paper were yellowed, but still firm. The ink lines inside sharp and dark. These were not blueprints like the ones in the basement, but something else dense, pages of calculations, diagrams of gears and levers, and annotations written in Whitcomb's precise script. Mara leaned in to see her hair brushing the edge. Of the table, Claire turned a page, and the drawing shifted from mechanical parts to what looked like a larger assembly-an entire machine sketched in profile, with measurements in both inches and a strange, unfamiliar notation. The diagrams were surrounded by small sketches of variations, as though Whitcomb had been refining the concept over time. Some pages contained nothing but columns of numbers, each accompanied by symbols Claire didn't recognize. Evan suggested they might be prototypes for something stored elsewhere, or designs too sensitive to leave out in the open. The hidden compartment, small and perfectly concealed, would have been an ideal place to hide work from prying eyes. They checked the remaining cylinders in the wall cavity. Each was wrapped as carefully as the first, their wax coverings intact, their labels different but equally cryptic. Claire decided not to open more than one for now. She wanted Dr. Rhodes to see them exactly as they had been found. Replacing the panel was not an option. The wood had splintered when they pried it loose, but Claire placed the remaining cylinders in a large plastic storage bin and carried them downstairs to the kitchen. She arranged them in a neat row on the floor, their waxed coverings catching the dim light. The more she looked at them, the more they seemed like sealed messages from another century, each holding a fragment of a story that had been buried twice once in the secrecy of Whitcomb's life, and again under the ashes of the fire. Evening, after the work was done and the tools put away, Claire sat at the kitchen table with the opened roll of papers spread before her. The house was quiet, except for the faint ticking of the old clock she'd found in a box near the front door. She traced a line of ink with her finger, not understanding the engineering, but sensing the deliberate care in every mark. Whatever these machines were meant to do, they had mattered deeply to the man who drew them. And now, more than a century later, they were hers to guard, at least until the truth of them could be uncovered. The knock came just after noon, sharp and deliberate, echoing through the gutted first floor. Claire was sorting through a box of salvageable hardware in the front hallway when she saw Adam Harlow framed in the doorway, his coat immaculate despite the wind outside. He didn't wait for an invitation, stepping over the threshold with a faint smile that carried more calculation than warmth. In his hand was a thick envelope, the kind that suggested formality and finality. He set it on the nearest surface, brushing away a thin layer of dust before sliding it. Toward her dot inside were neatly clipped pages, headed with the letterhead of a law firm in Burlington. The language was dense, but the point was simple enough. To an inspection report filed decades earlier and recently brought to light, the house had been deemed a structural hazard. Because of this, the county auction sale to Claire could be declared invalid, and ownership could revert back for reassessment. Harlow's offer to resolve the matter amicably came in the form of a cashier's check for $65,000. Already printed and waiting. Claire read the first page twice before looking up. Harlow leaned against the doorframe, hands in his pockets, his expression neutral. He spoke in an even tone, as though they were discussing whether or not the erasure of a legally binding sale. "It's a dangerous property," he said. "I'm offering you a way out. No loss, no legal fees, no hassle. You walk away with more than you paid and more than it's worth." Before she could answer, his eyes flicked briefly toward the stairwell leading to the basement. It was subtle, but she noticed. She told him she needed time to think, and after a thin-lipped smile, he left. The sound of his polished shoes fading across the porch The call from Renee came within the hour, as though the two of them had conspired to corner her. Claire didn't know how her sister had heard about the offer so quickly, whether Harlow had called her or someone in town had whispered. But Renee was blunt. "Sell it, Claire. You can't keep pouring time into that wreck. It's not a home. It's a liability. Take the money and run before it becomes your problem for real." Claire sat at the kitchen table with the envelope still open in front of her. Renee's voice through the phone was urgent, but not unkind, the way it sometimes was when she believed she was saving Claire from herself. "Think about the kids," she pressed. "You've got Mara and Evan living in a half-burnt building. No plumbing, no heat. What happens when winter hits? What happens if the county comes down on you?" It wasn't that Claire didn't understand the logic. The house was nowhere near livable. The repairs alone could drain her savings, and even then there was no guarantee she could make it a proper home. But she also knew Harlow's sudden generosity was not philanthropy, it was hunger. People didn't fight to acquire ruins, unless something inside was worth far more than the shell that held it. She thought about the basement, the locked cabinets, the blueprints, the cylinders Mara had found in the study. She thought about Dr. Rhodes's words, "These things have a way of disappearing." And she thought about Whitcomb, the man who had gone to such lengths to hide his work, only for it to sit in darkness for more than a century. Selling to Harlow would mean never knowing the full extent of what they had uncovered. Renee's voice broke into her thoughts again, softer this time. "I'm just saying. You've been through enough. You don't have to fight every battle." Claire promised she'd think about it, though she already knew her answer. Hanging up, she slid the envelope to the far end of the table. Out of reach, but still in sight, a tangible reminder of the line being drawn. That night, the wind rattled the tarps, covering the broken windows. Mara and Evan slept in their sleeping bags in what used to be the dining room, the only space they could keep reasonably warm with a small portable heater. Claire lay awake, listening to the house creak and settle. She thought about Harlow's eyes, the way they had shifted toward the basement door, and the measured confidence in his voice when he said, "No hassle." It wasn't a threat, not exactly, but it carried the weight of something that could become one dot in the dim glow from the hallway. The envelope still sat where she had left it, a silent challenge. She understood then that whatever she decided, she was no longer just fixing up a burnt-out house. She was holding something others wanted badly enough to send lawyers and whispers through the small veins of the town, and pressure like that didn't ease it, only built. The kitchen table had been cleared of everything except the open cylinders, the leather-bound ledger, and the sheaf of papers Claire had unrolled days earlier. Dr. Lillian Rhodes sat with her glasses low on her nose, her posture bent toward the documents as though proximity alone might coax their secrets into the open. Her fingertips moved lightly over the inked lines, pausing at margins where Whitcomb's handwriting curled into sharp angles. Then drifting to the careful hatching of gear teeth, the outlines of flywheels and channels. For hours, the only sounds were the scratch of her pencil in a small spiral notebook and the occasional rustle of pages as she shifted from one diagram to another. Evan hovered nearby, leaning over whenever she muttered something under her breath. Mara sat cross-legged on the floor, half listening, half distracted by the way dust motes drifted in the sunlight from the unshuttered window. Claire busied herself with boiling water for tea, resisting the urge to ask every 5 minutes what Dr. Rhodes was seeing. Finally, Rhodes straightened, her eyes brighter than when she had arrived. She tapped one diagram with the eraser of her pencil. "This," she said, "is a variation of a hydraulic turbine only. It's drawn here in 1908, maybe earlier. The first patents for this particular configuration didn't appear until the mid-1920s. She moved to another page, where a long cross-section showed water being channeled through a narrowing conduit, striking angled blades. And this design, she went on, could have powered an entire small factory. It's efficient in a way people weren't thinking about yet, at least not publicly." Claire leaned over the table. The words hydroelectric and patent seemed impossibly far from the burnt wood and broken plaster that had defined the house since she bought it. Rhodes's voice took on the rhythm of someone speaking half to herself, half to an audience. Whitcomb wasn't just tinkering, he was working on large-scale applications. Some of these diagrams are precursors to designs that became foundational in early hydroelectric projects. She paused, flipping back to the ledger. And the initials, these might be collaborators or correspondents. Hard to say. There are dates that don't align with any known filings, and some pages refer to private demonstrations in towns along the Connecticut River. She pointed to a sketch of a machine that looked nothing like the turbine's array of interlocking arms, each tipped with something like a paddle. This is stranger. It might be an experimental pump or something to do with irrigation. There are notations here about variable flow and load balance, decades ahead of the terminology. She gave a short laugh, without humor. If even half of this had been developed and patented in his name, Whitcomb would have been a wealthy man. Claire thought of Mrs. Keating's words, the rumors of theft, the whispers that industrialists had taken his ideas. She imagined Whitcomb in this same house, perhaps in the basement among the steel cabinets, hunched over these very pages, only to have the work buried when he vanished. Rhodes closed the ledger gently, as though it were fragile glass. "This isn't just history," she said. "This is proof if we can cross-reference these with the patents that came later. And if we can figure out why some designs never appeared at all." Evan asked if that meant the machines could be built now. Rhodes smiled faintly. Yes, and if they worked as intended, some of them could still be useful, especially the water systems. In an era obsessed with renewable energy, these could have real value. She hesitated before adding, "Which makes me wonder who else might already know they're here." That question hung in the air. Claire thought of Harlow's second visit, the envelope of legal threats, the way his gaze had flicked toward the basement. Rhodes packed her notes carefully, slipping her pencil into the coil of the spiral. "I'd advise you to make copies of everything immediately," she said. "Digital and physical. Keep the originals somewhere secure. Once word gets out about this, there's no telling who might come knocking." The light was fading outside, the kitchen growing dim, except for the small pool of illumination over the table. Claire could see the fine lines of ink more clearly now, their precision undulled by a century. She wondered if Whitcomb had ever imagined someone like her, someone with no training, no connection to industry, would be the one holding his work in a ruined house, debating how to protect it. And as Rhodes gathered her coat, leaving the document spread for one last glance, Claire felt the weight of that responsibility settle over her more heavily than before. These designs were not just relics. They were a key, and she was beginning to understand how many doors they could open. It was Evan who noticed the uneven line along the far wall of the basement, a thin seam running vertically where the cinder blocks met the poured concrete floor. He had been sweeping away dust in slow arcs, tracing the pattern of Whitcomb's strange etching on the support beams, when the broom bristles caught on a protruding edge. The sound it made was different from the rest of the wall dueler, almost metallic. He knelt, brushed away decades of grit with his sleeve, and called for Claire. Together they shifted one of the heavy steel cabinets that stood in front of the wall. The thing groaned on its casters, metal scraping faintly against concrete. Dust puffed up from the floor as it rolled aside, revealing the seam more clearly. It wasn't just a crack. There was an outline perfectly circular, nearly 7 feet. Tall cut into the concrete and framed by riveted steel, Claire reached out and ran her fingers over the cold surface. The steel was mottled with patches of oxidation, but beneath the rust, she could feel a smooth, deliberate curvature. Embedded bolts studied the perimeter like clockwork markers. At the center, a large wheel-shaped handle was recessed into the door, flanked by 2 heavy locking mechanisms that looked older than anything else in the house. Mara stood in the stairwell, clutching the flashlight and angling it so the beam hit the surface directly. The light caught faint engravings symbol again, the same one that had been etched into the beams and stamped into the key they had found. Only here, the lines were deeper, more deliberate, almost ceremonial in the way they encircled the handle. "Looks like a bank vault," Evan said, half awed, half wary. Claire couldn't disagree. She'd seen vault doors before in movies. In old photograph sand, this matched them in presence, if not in size. The frame extended deep into the wall, suggesting thickness far beyond an ordinary safe. Whatever was inside Whitcomb had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it sealed. Claire crouched to inspect the locking mechanisms. The metal was unbroken, no sign of forced entry. It didn't match the crude padlocks of the filing cabinets. This was precision engineering. Her hand rested on the wheel. It was cold enough to sting. She tried turning it, but it didn't budge. not even a fraction. Rhodes, who had been upstairs sorting her notes, came down at the sound of their voices. She stopped short when she saw the door, her expression sharpening in an instant. "This isn't something you open casually," she said, stepping closer to examine the locking plates. "Whitcomb must have commissioned this from a specialty fabricator. This would have cost more than the rest of the house combined." She pointed at the hinges massive, hidden within the frame. "This isn't just about keeping something safe from thieves. This is about sealing it against everything. Fire, water, maybe even explosives." The thought of explosives in connection with a door in her basement made Claire's stomach tighten. Evan asked if it could be opened with a brass key. Rhodes shook her head. "No, this isn't a key lock in the conventional sense. You'd need the combination. And even then, after 100 years, the mechanisms might be frozen." They stood in silence for a long moment, each imagining what could be behind it. More documents, prototypes of Whitcomb's machines, something dangerous enough to warrant this level of protection. Claire felt an odd mix of dread and curiosity. She thought of Harlow, of his insistence that the house was unsafe to rebuild. Had he known about this? The basement seemed colder now, the air heavy with the scent of old steel and dust. Claire reached out once more, pressing her palm against the cool metal. It was solid, immovable, yet it hummed with a kind of presence as if the door itself was aware of being discovered. Mara's flashlight beam wavered slightly, catching the edges of the engraved symbol, making it seem to shift in the shadows. Finally, Claire stepped back. "We don't touch it until we know more," she said, though she knew that leaving it sealed might be harder than opening it. The vault door was no longer just part of the basement wallet. It was a question that now hung over every decision they would make, and questions like that had a way of changing everything. The decision to open the vault did not come quickly. For days, the round steel door at the far end of the basement loomed like a silent challenge, its heavy wheel and engraved symbol drawing their eyes every time they descended the stairs. Claire spent evenings researching old safe mechanisms, calling in favors from anyone who might know a locksmith willing to attempt something of this scale. Most gave polite refusals. A few said they wouldn't touch it for any amount of money. In the end, it was Evan who found someone willing. A retired machinist named Hal, living 2 towns over, agreed to come take a look. He arrived with a battered leather tool bag, a frame of wiry steel under his flannel shirt, and eyes that lit up when he saw the vault. "Haven't seen one like this in years," he murmured, running a calloused hand over the engravings. "Custom build. Whoever made this didn't want anyone inside without their say-so." The process was slow. Hal worked with the patience of someone who understood that one wrong move could ruin the mechanism forever. The wheel groaned when he first tried it, frozen with a century's worth of corrosion. He dabbed oil into the seams, waited, tried again. Mara watched from the stairs, flashlight in hand, while Evan crouched nearby, studying every twist and tap of Hal's tools. Claire stood with her arms folded, fighting the urge to pace. Hours passed. The air in the basement thickened with the scent of old lubricant and metal filings. Hal paused often, pressing his ear to the steel, listening as he turned the wheel a fraction at a time. At last, there was a deep, resonant click-like, a heavy latch shifting into place. Hal looked up and gave a small nod. One more turn should do it. The wheel moved more easily now, completing a slow arc before stopping with a second, heavier click. Hal stepped back, motioning for Claire. "Your door," he said simply. Claire hesitated only a moment before gripping the wheel. It was cold. Under her palms, solid and sure. She turned at the final inches until something inside released with a dull thud. The hinges, though hidden, moved with surprising ease. The seal broke with a hiss of air, stale and metallic, as if the space beyond had been untouched for generations. The door swung inward, revealing darkness and a faint smell of aged wood. Evan shone the flashlight inside, and shapes began to take form. Rows of wooden crates stacked neatly against the far wall, each one stamped in black lettering, J. Whitcomb, 1909. The wood was darkened with age but intact, the stenciled letters still sharp. Claire stepped inside, the sound of her boots echoing on the smooth concrete floor. The room was smaller than she expected, more like a chamber than a full extension of the basement. The crates varied in size, some long and narrow, others squat and square, but all were sealed tight with hammered nails. Mara ran her hand over the nearest crate, tracing the name. "It's like he left them here for someone to find," she said softly. Evan pointed to a stack in the corner, where the top crate bore a different marking, a small symbol burned into the wood, matching the etching on the key in the beams. Claire crouched beside one of the smaller crates, testing its weight with a careful push. It didn't budge easily. She imagined what could be inside, more blueprints perhaps, or pieces of the machines Whitcomb had designed. The thought that these crates had been sealed since before the First World War gave her a shiver. Hal, leaning in the doorway, whistled low. "Whatever's in there, it's been waiting a long time." He tapped the frame of the vault door with his knuckles, and it was important enough to protect better than any bank. Claire straightened, her eyes sweeping over the rows of crates. The basement no longer felt like a ruin. It felt like a vault in every sense of the word, not just for metal and money, but for a man's life's work. She didn't yet know if opening those crates would answer the questions they'd been chasing, or raise new ones entirely. But she knew one thing with certainty: nothing about this house would ever be ordinary. Again, the first crate they chose to open was one of the smaller ones near the center of the room. Evan worked the claw of a hammer under the rusted nails, each one groaning as it loosened from the aged wood. The lid came free with a dry creak, releasing a faint smell of machine oil and varnished metal. Still sharp, despite the century that had passed. Inside, layers of straw packing cradled something heavy and gleaming in the beam of the flashlight. Claire reached in carefully, brushing away the straw until her hands closed around a curved assembly of polished brass and steel. It was no larger than a shoebox, but the complexity of it was immediately apparent. Interlocking gears meshed with precision, and a small turbine wheel, no wider than her palm, sat mounted within the frame. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Each piece fitted as though machined yesterday. Dr. Rhodes leaned closer, her breath quickening. "That's a micro-hydroelectric turbine," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Compact, self-contained. This is decades ahead of its time. Whitcomb was designing power generation for small-scale, local use when most of the country hadn't even been fully electrified." She traced the edge of the turbine housing with one finger. If this had been patented, it could have changed rural industry completely. Beneath the turbine lay a bundle of sealed envelopes, their paper yellowed but intact, each tied with twine. Claire untied one and unfolded its contents, revealing crisp sheets of drafting paper covered in precise mechanical diagrams. The title block bore Whitcomb's name, but where the patent number should have been, the space was blank. In the margins were notes in a tight, slanted hand, full of calculations and references to pending trials and optimal casing alloys. They opened another crate and found a set of gear assemblies mounted on oak boards, the teeth of each wheel cut so. Finally, they caught the light-like jewelry. Some were arranged in complex cascades, others in compact clusters, each one labeled with inked tags. Rhodes explained that these were likely transmission models meant to convert rotational force into multiple outputs, technology that would later be vital in automotive and industrial machinery. Further back, stacked between layers of straw, were glass jars sealed with wax, each containing small metal components, ball bearings, springs, and machined rods alongside folded slips of paper that described their tolerances. Evan picked up one jar and held it to the light, marveling at how perfectly the parts were made, how each seemed free of even the smallest flaw. At the bottom of one crate was a metal case, its latch still tight. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a narrow cylinder, no longer than a forearm, covered in etched markings. It was heavier than it looked, the balance precise. Rhodes speculated it could be part of an early experimental generator, something Whitcomb might have been testing. Before scaling it up, she admitted she had never seen anything like it outside of museum archives, and even then, only in photographs. Mara, drawn to a stack of smaller crates, pried one open herself. Inside were rows of envelopes, each marked with a year and a location: 1907, Burlington, 1908, Rutland, 1909, Hartford. Every envelope was sealed, the wax impressed with Whitcomb's symbol. Claire opened one carefully to find detailed letters describing meetings with investors, sketches of exhibition layouts, and instructions for assembling devices for demonstration. Many ended abruptly, as though written in haste, with no follow-up. Pages. The deeper they went, the more apparent it became that Whitcomb had been working on multiple projects at once, many of which had never reached the public. It wasn't just a workshop's worth of forgotten inventions. They were looking at an entire alternate path of industrial development. Locked away beneath a house that had burned almost to its bones, when they finally stepped back from the opened crates, the room seemed transformed. It was no longer just a chamber behind a sealed vault door. It was a museum, a workshop, and a time capsule all at once. Claire felt the weight of what they had uncovered, pressing in from every side. Not just the value of the objects, but the knowledge they carried, and the question of why Whitcomb had chosen to hide it rather than share it with the world. The answer, she suspected, might be buried somewhere deeper. In a story that had been waiting for more than 100 years to be told. The knock at the front door was sharp, deliberate, and far too early for anyone to be stopping by without warning. Claire wiped her hands on her jeans and opened it to find Adam Harlow standing there, flanked by two men in dark jackets who carried clipboards but didn't bother to introduce themselves. Harlow held out a thick envelope, his expression perfectly polite in a way that made her skin prickle. "This is a court order," he said smoothly, as though reading from a script. "We've been authorized to inspect this property for possible environmental hazards. As you can imagine, fire-damaged structures often conceal dangerous materials, lead paint, asbestos, compromised wiring. If we find any serious violations, it may be necessary to condemn the site entirely for public safety." Claire took the envelope, but didn't open it right away. "Convenient timing," she said. "You've been trying to get your hands on this place since the day I bought it." Harlow's smile didn't falter. "My interest is purely civic, Ms. Donovan. This is about protecting the community, not about your personal investment." He gestured toward the two men who shifted, impatiently, clearly eager to get inside. "We can begin now, or I can notify the sheriff's office that you're obstructing a lawful inspection." Before Claire could answer, Dr. Rhodes appeared from the hallway, brushing sawdust off her sleeves. She had been cataloging some of the smaller inventions upstairs and now eyed Harlow like a hawk circling over a snake. "Claire," she said quietly, "this is a tactic. They aren't here for asbestos. If that order gives them unrestricted access, they can document or remove anything they claim is a hazard, anything they decide shouldn't be in your possession. That includes the contents of the basement." Harlow's eyes flicked toward Rhodes, and for the briefest moment, his composure cracked. "I'm not sure what you think you're implying, Doctor," he said, his tone a shade cooler. "But unless you're here as a certified environmental inspector, your opinion isn't relevant." Claire opened the envelope and scanned the paperwork. The language was dense, the kind of legal phrasing designed to obscure more than it revealed. But one clause stood out: full access to all structures and storage areas, including locked rooms, for purposes of inventory and removal of items deemed unsafe for human occupancy. She looked up sharply. "This isn't about safety, it's about taking what's mine." Harlow tilted his head, as if humoring a stubborn child. "It's about preventing harm. If you have nothing dangerous in that basement of yours, you have nothing to worry about." Evan had appeared at the top of the stairs, silent but tense, while Mara peeked from behind the living room doorway. Claire could feel the weight of their eyes, the way they were waiting for her to stand her ground. She folded the papers and handed them back to Harlow without a word. "You can tell the court," she said, "that I'll be reviewing this with my attorney before letting anyone set foot inside." One of the clipboard men stepped forward. "Ma'am, refusal to comply could result in fines." "Then fine me," Claire interrupted. "I'm not signing away my rights because you showed up with a piece of paper and an agenda." Harlow studied her for a long moment, the polite mask slipping just enough for her to see the irritation underneath. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice lower now. "Good," Claire replied. "It's supposed to be hard to take what doesn't belong to you without another word." Harlow turned, signaling his men to follow. They walked back to the waiting SUV parked at the curb, the dark windows reflecting the skeletal outline of the house. Claire watched until they drove away, her pulse steady but her hands trembling. Rhodes stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. "He'll be back. And next time, he'll bring more than just paperwork. We need to make sure what's in that basement is documented and secured. If he manages to get inside with the law on his side, we could lose everything Whitcomb left behind. Claire nodded, her mind already moving through possibilities. Extra locks, hidden storage, maybe even moving the most valuable items out of the house entirely. She didn't know how far Harlow's influence reached, but she understood now that protecting the property wasn't just about holding onto a building. It was about keeping history out of the hands of people who saw it only in terms of profit and control. The wind had picked up outside, rattling loose panes in the blackened window frames as Claire sorted through a stack of brittle folders in the study. She had been meaning to organize the papers Dr. Rhodes had already examined, keeping the most important ones separate in case Harlow made another unannounced visit. Most of it was familiar now: blueprints, letters, invoices, but at the very bottom of the pile, wedged between two warped ledger covers, was a flat leather folio she didn't remember seeing before. The leather was dry and cracked, its strap fastened with a tarnished brass button. She carried it to the dining table and unfastened the strap carefully, half expecting the brittle material to split under her fingers. Inside was a stack of folded documents wrapped in a faded blue ribbon. The first few were ordinary enough receipts for machine parts, bank drafts, correspondence with suppliers, but beneath them lay a heavier, cream-colored sheet with a deep crease down the middle. The ink was still bold despite its age, the handwriting precise and formal dot at the top. In ornate lettering were the words "Declaration of Trust" and "Custodial Assignment," followed by the name Jonas Whitcomb. Claire scanned the lines, her heart slowing as the meaning took shape. Whitcomb had drafted this document in 1909, witnessed and notarized, stating in unequivocal terms that all works, designs, prototypes, and intellectual property contained within the premises at 418 Oak Hollow Roadwood, in the event of his absence or death, remained secured in situ until discovered by a person who could lawfully claim stewardship by virtue of discovery and preservation. The phrasing was oddly specific. It did not name an heir nor any corporate successor. Instead, it outlined that the future custodian would not be determined by bloodline, but by the act of discovery itself. Whoever found the property and chose to preserve its contents in good faith would be recognized as Whitcomb's lawful custodian. There were clauses about the custodian's responsibilities to safeguard the inventions from misuse, to ensure their study and development served public benefit, and to prevent their sale for destructive or exploitative purposes. At the bottom, Whitcomb's signature sprawled in black ink, bold and deliberate. Next to it were to witness signatures, along with a seal from a law firm in Burlington dated October 14, 1909. A smaller sheet tucked behind it bore an addendum, written in the same hand but a different ink, noting that the trust was binding upon any party seeking legal claim or forfeiture of the premises. The language was sharp, almost defiant. This wasn't simply a sentimental note from an inventor. It was a legally armored statement meant to outlast any opportunist. Dr. Rhodes arrived moments later, drawn by Claire's call from the study. She read the document twice, then a third time, her brow furrowed. "Claire," she said quietly, "this isn't just an old piece of paper. If this trust was properly recorded, it overrides almost any claim Harlow could make. You're not just the property owner, you're the custodian by Whitcomb's own legal design. That means if he tries to argue, you have no right to the contents. This is your answer." They discussed the possibilities, careful not to let hope run too far ahead. Rhodes explained that the key would be verifying the authenticity of the notarization and the legal standing of such a clause in modern courts. Even if Whitcomb's original law firm no longer existed, its records might be archived somewhere in Vermont's legal history collections. Claire felt a quiet steadiness settle over her, something she hadn't felt since the day she signed her name at the auction. She placed the trust document in a protective sleeve from Rhodes's bag, sealing it between sheets of archival plastic. The wind outside rattled the house again, but this time it sounded different, less like a threat and more like the old walls were acknowledging her. For the first time, she felt as though the building itself was choosing to keep her here. In her mind, she could already picture Harlow's face when he saw it the moment he realized his leverage was gone. But she also knew this wasn't just about winning a fight. It was about honoring Whitcomb's trust in every sense of the word. He had written those lines more than a century ago for someone he would never meet. and somehow, against all odds, that someone had turned out to be her. The basement felt colder than usual, though the portable work lights cast a harsh yellow glow across the concrete floor. The filing cabinets stood like silent sentinels against the walls, their metal faces dulled by age, but the center of the room was cleared for a folding table and a half-circle of mismatched chairs. Claire stood beside Dr. Rhodes, her arms crossed, watching as the small group filed in. Adam Harlow arrived first in a pressed charcoal suit, followed by 2 attorneys, carrying leather portfolios. Behind them came a county official in a windbreaker, with a town seal embroidered over the chest, and a court clerk holding a stack of stamped forms. Harlow's eyes swept the room like he already owned it. "Shall we proceed?" he asked, as though the outcome had been decided before anyone sat down. Claire didn't answer. Dr. Rhodes took a seat, laying a thick binder on the table. Her movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial. As she opened it to the first page, a plastic-sleeved copy of Jonas Whitcomb's trust document, the original safely stored in a secure location. "This," Rhodes began, her voice level, but carrying through the room, "is the legally authenticated declaration of trust and custodial assignment, signed by Jonas Whitcomb in 1909. The signatures have been verified by a handwriting expert, and the notarization cross-referenced with archival court records from the same year. In addition, we have located the surviving ledgers of Whitcomb's law firm, which confirm the filing of this trust in the county. Registrar's office on October 15, 1909. She slid a separate folder toward the county official, who began leafing through it with furrowed brows. Harlow's attorney leaned forward, tapping the document with a manicured finger. "Even if this is authentic, it's over a century old. Trust law has changed considerably since then. This clause, ordinarily, no, but the state's inheritance code recognizes surviving trusts of historical and intellectual property when the original filing predates legislative revisions, especially when the property in question was never lawfully transferred or seized, which means Whitcomb's intellectual property rights remain intact, and by his own wording, those rights passed to the lawful discoverer of the premises' secured contents. That would be Ms. Donovan." The county official looked up. "Is there proof she meets that condition?" Claire stepped forward, her voice steady. "When I bought this property at auction, the basement was locked behind an industrial door. The contents had never been cataloged, never removed. I found the key on the premises. I opened it. I discovered Whitcomb's work." She let the weight of each word settle before adding, "and I've preserved it." Harlow leaned back, a smile flickering but not reaching his eyes. "This is an admirable bit of theater. But let's be clear, public safety concerns override any antique trust. If I can demonstrate environmental hazard, this place will be condemned, and everything in it moved under state supervision." Rhodes met his gaze. "You can try, but the moment any item leaves this property without the custodian's consent, you're in violation of state and federal intellectual property protections. And unlike your court order for an inspection, those laws carry criminal penalties." Silence settled over the table, broken only by the low hum of the work lights. The county official finally closed the folder in front of him. "I'll need to review this with the registrar's office, but on the surface, the documentation is sound. Until then, no removal or alteration of materials will be authorized." Harlow's jaw tightened. His attorneys began gathering their things, already murmuring about appeals and injunctions. He stood slowly, smoothing the front of his jacket, and for the briefest moment, his eyes met Claire's. There was no warmth there, only calculation, as though he was already plotting the next move. When the group left, the basement seemed to exhale. Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Rhodes closed the binder and looked at her. "This isn't over," she said, "but today we've drawn a line they can't cross without breaking the law." Claire glanced around at the cabinets, the vault door, the scattered blueprints. For now, they were safe. And for the first time since stepping into the ruined house, she felt that the ground beneath her might hold. The letter from the Vermont State Historical Preservation Office arrived 2 days after the confrontation, printed on thick paper with an embossed seal at the top. Claire read it twice at the kitchen table before sliding it across to Dr. Rhodes, who scanned it with quick, precise eyes. The language was formal, almost ceremonial, but its meaning was plain. The state had moved to secure the contents of the basement for cataloging and protection, citing their unquestionable historical and technological significance. Yet in the final paragraph, the document stated that, under the terms of Whitcomb's original trust, Claire Donovan was to be named the legal trustee of the collection. That single word, trustee, shifted the air in the room. It meant the state could oversee and manage the items for conservation, but Claire would retain ultimate custodial authority. She alone would decide where and how the inventions were studied, displayed, or restored. Rhodes explained it in simpler terms. They're acknowledging Whitcomb's wishes. You are the legal voice for this collection, even under state care. The next morning, 2 large vans arrived, each marked with the state's preservation. Emblem, a team of specialists in gloves and work jackets, filed into the house. Led by a supervisor who introduced herself as Margaret Lyle, her manner was efficient, but not unkind, explaining that the removal was a temporary measure to stabilize and document each item in a controlled environment. These pieces have been sitting here for over a century, she said. Some are at risk of corrosion. Our facility can stop the damage before it spreads. Claire followed them into the basement, watching as they moved methodically down the rows of filing cabinets. Each drawer was opened, its contents photographed in place before being removed. The blueprints were laid flat between sheets of acid-free paper. The metal prototypes were cushioned in custom foam supports before being placed into archival crates. Even the crates themselves were labeled with the Whitcomb name, the year, and the original location in the basement. It was not lost on her that Harlow was absent. Perhaps he had heard the news and realized the state's involvement made a direct seizure impossible. Still, Claire couldn't shake the sense that he would resurface and that his interest had not evaporated. The difference now was that any future interference would pit him not only against her, but against a state agency with its own lawyers and historians. Upstairs, in what had once been the parlor, Lyle laid out a small folding desk and began drafting an official chain of custody log. She paused to hand Claire a duplicate copy of the trustee designation letter, advising her to keep it somewhere safe. If anyone challenges you, Lyle said, this is your shield. It confirms you are not only the owner of the property, but the appointed custodian of its historical assets. That's not something we overturn lightly. The cataloging continued for hours, the sound of careful footsteps and the muted thud of crates being carried up the stairs. Mara hovered near the doorway for much of the day, watching as objects she had only recently seen for the first time disappeared into protective boxes. Evan was quieter, but at one point he crouched beside a specialist packing a gear assembly, asking questions about how the rust would be treated. By late afternoon, the basement was almost empty. The filing cabinets stood open and hollow, their cold interiors reflecting the work lights. The vault door, too, had been cleared of its crates. Claire stepped inside one last time before the lights were switched off, running her fingers over the smooth concrete support beams where Whitcomb's strange symbol had been carved. For now, the space felt stripped of its mystery, but not its weight. She knew the real heart of Whitcomb's work was not gone, it was simply being kept safe, waiting for its next chapter. When the vans pulled away, Lyle handed her a final packet of documents and a schedule for the cataloging process. She promised periodic updates and invited Claire to visit the preservation facility whenever she wished. Standing on the front steps as the taillights disappeared down the street, Claire realized this was the first time she wasn't worried about the inventions being lost or stolen. For years, the house had been seen as a ruin, a shell left to decay. Now, for the first time, it was tied to something larger than itself, a piece of history that the state had pledged to protect, with her as its appointed guardian. The building was still burned and battered, the repairs far from over, but she no longer felt like she was holding back the tide alone. In a quiet, almost reluctant way, the house had claimed her, and the state had confirmed what Whitcomb's words had already said. She was meant to keep its secrets and to see them through. The offer came in the form of a letter delivered by courier, its envelope thick and heavy, embossed with the name of a multinational energy conglomerate. Claire opened it at the kitchen table, the morning light falling across the page as she read. The proposal was direct, a purchase of the Whitcomb patents, prototypes, and all associated intellectual property for a lump sum that made her blink twice. The number was more than she had ever imagined, seeing millions, enough to buy any house she wanted, erase every debt, and live without financial worry for the rest of her life. For a long while, she didn't move. The coffee on the table cooled as she thought about what those figures meant. It wasn't just the freedom from work or the ability to provide for Evan and Mara without hesitation. It was the possibility of comfort, of safety, of a life unburdened by the constant weighing of expenses against necessity. After years of scraping by, it was the sort of stability she had. Once assumed, belonged only to other people. She didn't mention the letter to the children right away. Instead, she called Dr. Rhodes and asked her to come over. When Rhodes arrived, she read the offer twice and set it down without speaking. Her expression was measured, but there was an edge in her voice when she finally said, "They don't just want the patents, they want to bury them. I've seen this before. They'll buy everything, lock it away in their archives, and make sure nothing ever reaches the public." Claire knew this was likely true. She had learned enough from Whitcomb's work to understand its implications. The designs for turbines and energy systems weren't just relics of mechanical ingenuity. They were the kind of ideas that could still disrupt the present-day market. Affordable, renewable power that didn't depend on massive infrastructure investments. Scalable systems that could work in rural towns as easily as cities. Ideas that, in the wrong hands, would vanish forever. That night, after Evan and Mara were asleep, she sat at the dining room table with the offer in front of her. She imagined the things she could do for her children: college, a secure home, a chance to travel and see more than the small slice of the world they knew. Then she thought of Whitcomb himself, sealing his work away in the basement for a future he might never see. He had not sold it to the industrialists of his time, even when they could have made him wealthy. He had hidden it, waiting for someone who might understand its worth beyond money. The next day, she called Rhodes again, but this time with a decision. Together, they began drafting the charter for a non-profit foundation bearing Whitcomb's name. Its mission would be twofold: to fund renewable energy research based on his designs, and to offer scholarships for students in engineering and environmental science. Every patent, every prototype, every blueprint would be held in trust by the foundation, accessible to researchers and innovators who could carry the work forward. When the energy company's representative called to follow up, Claire listened politely before telling them she would not be selling. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a tone of disbelief that hardened into a clipped farewell. She hung up without regret. The weeks that followed were consumed with paperwork, legal filings, and meetings with the Preservation Office. To arrange the transfer of patent rights into the foundation's name, Mara helped brainstorm the scholarship criteria, while Evan pored over the turbine blueprints with a fascination that made Claire wonder if he might one day become one of the foundation's first grant recipients. By the time the foundation was formally announced, the press had begun to take notice. Reporters called it an unprecedented act of preservation and public trust. To Claire, it was simpler than that. She had been given the keys to something that could change the world, and she refused to be the one who locked it away. The millions would have changed her life, but this had the chance to change many more. The work took months, stretching through the tail end of winter into the first warm days of spring. At first, the house felt like nothing more than blackened beams exposed, floorboards pried up, walls stripped down to bare studs. Every day the air carried the scent of sawdust and fresh paint, layered over the faint, stubborn trace of smoke that lingered from the fire years before. Claire was there for nearly every step, walking the rooms with the contractors, making decisions. That felt as personal as any she had ever made. Which banister to replace and which to refinish. Which windows could be restored and which needed new glass. How to keep the bones of the Victorian without turning it into a museum piece. Evan took an interest in the structural work, peppering the carpenters with questions about joists and load-bearing walls. Mara, meanwhile, claimed the role of unofficial designer, taping up swatches of wallpaper in the upstairs hallway, pointing out where she thought a reading nook should go, insisting her room should face the morning light. Claire let them both have their say, knowing that, in a way, the house was as much theirs as hers. They had all lived through the long months when it was nothing more than ash and echo, and they had all stood together the day the basement revealed its secrets. By early summer, the transformation was visible even from the street. The once facade had been repaired and repainted in deep green with cream trim. the original detailing around the windows carefully restored. The porch, rebuilt from photographs found at the town hall, wrapped warmly around the front, its boards fresh, but already feeling like they belonged. Neighbors began stopping by just to comment on the progress. Even Mrs. Keating, who had once warned Claire away from the place entirely, admitted that it looked alive again. The basement, though still empty of its historic contents, was not forgotten. Claire had insisted the vault door remain in place, a silent reminder of what had been discovered. The concrete walls were cleaned but left bare, the etched symbols preserved without covering. When the Preservation Office returned for their final inspection, they remarked on the care taken to keep the space intact. "It tells part of the story," Claire explained simply, though she knew it told more than most would ever know. Moving day came with the kind of weather that seemed to approve of the occasion clear skies. A light breeze, the sun angling just enough to make the restored glass windows glow. The moving truck rumbled up the driveway, and soon the empty rooms began to fill with the familiar shapes of their lives. The worn sofa they'd kept through 3 rentals, the kitchen table with its uneven leg, the mismatched chairs that had always somehow fit together. Each piece felt different here, settled against walls that no longer smelled of soot, beneath ceilings that had been mended and painted. That first night, they ate takeout on the living room floor. Mara insisted on lighting the small antique lamp they had found in one of the upstairs closets, now rewired and glowing softly in the corner. Evan wandered down to the basement before bed, returning a few minutes later with the quiet look he sometimes wore when thinking about Whitcomb's machines. "It feels different down there," he said. "Like it's ours now." Claire stood at the window after they'd gone to sleep, looking out over the yard. The green paint caught the moonlight in a way that made the house seem almost new, but she knew it carried layers of history within it, some seen, most hidden. Behind these walls, Whitcomb had worked on ideas meant for a future he would never reach. In these rooms, her family had made the choice to protect that work, to let it live on in a way that couldn't be bought or erased. It was a house again, not just a ruin, but it was also a quiet monument to a day in the basement when history shifted in their hands. They had rebuilt more than the walls and floors. They had rebuilt a place where something remarkable had been found and kept safe. And in the stillness of that first night, Claire felt certain that both the house and its story were exactly where they belonged.